Hopefully everything is working. I still feel like I'm going to mess something up, so there's probably something messed up. But hey, everybody, I'm glad to see you here. I suppose that I'll just say some introductory remarks while I wait for more people to show up. Welcome. So some of you may have seen I've been posting some stuff in the community section and on my blog. So I finished up the PhD officially. So I had finished some time ago, but because of various sorts of things, the official conferral was pushed back to the end of May. So I'm all done. And some other announcements. I have moved the blog over to Substack. So I have a new link there. So go check that out. You could go subscribe on Substack. If you've already subscribed, I think I have some method for like transferring people over. But just in case, or whatever it is that you're doing, make sure for the blog, if you want to keep up to date with that you go subscribe over on Substack. So hopefully that will help me grow. Thank you for everybody that contributed to the poll on that. It was overwhelming. So I think I had 20, 30 responses, something like that. And I think I got like 90 something percent said Substack only. And then a few of you said, keep your old blog too. But nobody said to only keep it on the original site. It was on Wix. So that was pretty overwhelming consensus. So I guess some of the main thing for Substack is just probably increased visibility and hopefully it could grow. Anyway, having got the degree sort of officially behind me, I'm really hoping to grow this channel. And I have a few plans for more content. You'll also see there was a bit of a lull back in April while I was tying up things with other stuff that I've been working on. So now there should be a lot more freedom for me to really grow this channel. And then I guess I could also, the summer is a good chance to really have a little bit more time to work on growing this. So I want to make this into something bigger. Same thing with the blog. I'd like to eventually have it be kind of a meta ethics hub and an experimental philosophy hub. I don't think that there are many of those, if there are any at all. So there are blogs that discuss philosophy more generally, but I guess I'm kind of a specialist in this more narrow area. So, I might start posting stuff about conferences, I don't know, special entries in journals, like calls for papers and that kind of thing. So stuff like that might be of more interest to people with a more academic background. So if that's not your thing, that's cool. Just don't pay as much attention to that. I'll also be continuing with a lot of the metaphilosophical critique now that I've got a lot of stuff behind me. I still have a lot of work to papers to get published and that sort of thing. But I'm also turning my attention towards new readings. So I'm reading a lot more stuff on intuitions and philosophical methods. And I do expect to shift into a more metaphilosophical direction more generally, but I'm definitely not going to stop talking about meta ethics. So that covers a lot of things. And today I'll be talking about metaphilosophical stuff. So let me say hi to people in the chat. Okay, so someone is off to watch Spider-Man and they're hoping that I'll be here when they get back. I hope so. I got someone new. So welcome. I hope if you've already been here and I didn't recognize you, you change your profile picture or something, I apologize for that. Someone that says initiate the cringe. So apparently this is cringe. Okay. All right. We got a hi. Hey, thanks for being on last week. Oh, I should also say I'm much more open now to people popping on and joining me in conversation. Hopefully we could get some more people on here. It was just in someone else's live stream. So maybe I don't know. I don't think I mentioned, hey, I'm going on my live, so they're not going to know I'm here. But I'd like to get more people that are YouTubers and stream and do that sort of stuff to pop in and say hi and talk. I'd like this to be like some of the other channels I've been on, where it's a lot more free flowing and people just sort of show up. So I'm trying to be more chill. Like I'm not good. Like I'm going to read you something. All right, and we got one more hello, and we still only have a few people here, so hopefully things will grow. Okay, and then I'm already thirsty, so. Oh, we got another one. Thank you. Yeah, you could still call me Lance. It's fine. Please don't call me doctor. I know people are being funny with it, but it's also, I would say it's ironic, although people overuse that term. It's not ironic, but today I'm going to be talking about why. At least one of the things we'll talk about, why we shouldn't put too much stock in philosophical consensus and in like the PhilPapers survey results. So Yeah, I guess I should talk a bit about that. I wrote this. I started this blog series called the PhilPapers Fallacy. So I'll give a little bit of background for that before I talk about it. The Oh, okay. So, oh, you're back already. Weren't a big fan. That's too bad. I haven't. I don't know. I don't really see a lot of movies, so too bad. I hope this is entertaining at least. I don't have a big Hollywood budget, but oh, that's something I should mention. I just upgraded this to try to make it in 1080, and it's not. It doesn't look like it's doing it. So I'm going to have to figure out how to do that because I should get a little bit higher def. But yeah, that's definitely something that's a big thing that I'd like to do for this channel as I grow it. And I guess I'll save some remarks about that for the end of the video. But I mean, you could see I don't have any kind of cool studio. So I see all these people with this super awesome production value for their channels. And I would really like to have that. I'd like to have the cool LEDs and I don't know, a better microphone, definitely a better camera because this one is still doing this autofocus thing. If I turned it off autofocus, it's worse. I tried doing that and it was not workable. So definitely new camera, new mic. I'd love to get some new headphones. There's lots of stuff to work on as far as improving my setup here. Oh, cool! I'm seeing more and more people comment to say hi here and ready for some metaphilosophy. So I guess I'll get into that. So I'm going to be talking a bit about this blog series that I've started. I think I'm on the third post now. There's been 9 sections and then a sort of announcement of the series. And this turned into something that was much longer. So I'll give a little bit of background. Back in 2009, there was the survey that was sent out to analytic philosophers. Well, mostly analytic philosophers. I'm sure some of them were not. And it was administered by Bourget and Chalmers. It's called the PhilPapers survey. So there's one of those back in 2009, and it asked a set of questions. And then they waited about 11 years. They did a new one, and then there's the 2020 PhilPapers survey. So I will post a link to that in the chat, and you could go check that out. There's a lot of really cool information. All right, so I posted a link to that, and I suppose I will pin it for now. So definitely do check that out. Bookmark it, do what you got to do. There's a lot of info there. So check that out. So what that is they sent it out. I always try to get the exact numbers, even though there's no reason to do this. I think it was sent out to, I don't know how many people sent out to, probably like 3,000 or so, but they got 1,750 responses to a big series of questions. And what this was intended to be is a sort of general census of the philosophical positions of those to whom the survey was sent to. This was predominantly, you could look at the demographic breakdown, like which countries people were from and that sort of thing. I think it was 48% in the United States, and then you had the really big chunk from Canada, New Zealand, Australia, UK, Germany, and then a few other countries. And then it drops off sharply, and then many countries are not represented at all. So it's predominantly, and then they also have the philosophical approach that people identify with, and it's mostly analytic philosophers. So analytic philosophy is predominantly associated with the United States and the UK, and I guess you could say the Anglophone world more broadly, rather than it's often contrasted with continental Europe, primarily France and Germany. And so it's primarily a survey of people operating within the Anglophone academic philosophical world, which isn't to say that there aren't people that identify as or are familiar with or have expertise in continental philosophy and other philosophical traditions, but it's mostly analytic philosophers. So that survey was sent out. You could definitely go through and have a look at it. And some of the results might be surprising to you. They're definitely interesting. I emphasize those demographic details only because sometimes people will say that this is a survey of philosophers as if it were representative of all philosophers, and it's not. It's representative primarily of a particular philosophical tradition that's largely localized to specific languages, regions, and philosophical traditions. It is not representative of all philosophers. That isn't to say it's useless or uninformative, but it is to say that we shouldn't presume that the percentages we see there are reflective of what you would achieve were you to have a sort of perfect survey. where you knew every philosopher's position on things. And then, of course, there's also questions about how exactly the survey was administered. Is it over-representative of philosophers at, say, quote unquote top universities, that sort of thing. Oh, yeah. So that's funny. I think we were saying this at the same time. Also, we're saying it's targeted at the top 100 departments. I never really looked to see if that's the case. Is that the case? If so, I suppose I would say that's even more troubling. Yeah. So there's certainly going to be some demographic causes for concern with this sort of thing. So do keep that in mind as well. So there's a variety of considerations. Again, though, that doesn't mean it's useless. And there's certainly going to be people that consider analytic philosophy, at least compared to continental philosophy, to have various sorts of methodological edges. So if you're not familiar with this distinction, often continental philosophy is maligned as more obscure and not as rigorous and not as focused on precision and clarity and rigor and sort of formal argumentation. It's more literary. That isn't, there are certainly people that I think do or can do good continental philosophy. And there's certainly much to be desired in the appearance of precision, clarity, and rigor in analytic philosophy. Often I think it has these sort of superficial trappings of those characteristics while failing to really live up to those ideals. In fact, personally, I think this is very, very common. And someone could talk all they want in a sort of a quasi-formal way without really saying much of substance. So I think analytic philosophy has aspirations of clarity, precision, and rigor, and in practice has succeeded to some extent, but is certainly not the sort of paragon of epistemic virtue and wondrous clarity and precision that one might hope for. So, I, of course, tend to take this pretty critical perspective, and that's what I'm talking about today. Anyway, so some of the things, some of the things that prompted me to start this blog series are a few types of claims that you'll often see. One of them was direct appeals to the PhilPapers survey. Now, those come in a variety of forms, and it's rarely explicit for someone to say something like this. Well, I looked at the survey results for this particular philosophical question, and it turns out more than half of philosophers endorse this position. Therefore, you ought to believe the position, or the position is true. I've never heard anybody say that, like quite so strong as that. And that would be a ridiculous position to take, because it'd be really weird to say if like 51% endorse A over B, that A is very likely to be true. You would take it presumably to be at best some small evidence. And if 95% endorse something, maybe that's quite a bit stronger evidence, but presumably it's still not necessarily decisive. Perhaps you could think that it is, but I haven't seen that. What I have seen are a couple categories of remarks related to the PhilPapers survey. One of them, and this is not very common, but I have seen it, are explicit references to it as evidence. And in some cases, people qualifying this by saying it's strong evidence. More likely, though, if people do qualify it, they'll say it's weak or modest or some degree of evidence. But you will see some people cite it as quite strong evidence. And of course, the degree to which it's considered strong or weak, that's not very specific, and it could vary. So someone could say strong or very strong, or, it could also depend on the particular survey question in question. So if it's, the higher the percentage in favor of one view over another, presumably the greater the evidence that that's taken to be for that particular issue. Okay, so let me stop and address a couple chats. Hey, how's it going? Yeah, so you could call it an ad populum fallacy, but this isn't specifically a claim that it's the most common view among people in general. So it's not really an appeal to like the populace. It's an appeal to specialists. So someone might claim that it's some type of appeal to authority fallacy, but these fallacies are pretty squishy. I don't know if I'd really call these fallacies. I mean, is it a fallacy to appeal to what most doctors think about a medical issue about which they are experts? Probably not. So a lot of these informal fallacies I think are overused. I don't consider it a fallacy to apportion the degree of evidence to any particular consensus or perspective among experts that is warranted. The problem is that it can be overused, or one can consider it to carry greater evidential weight than it actually does. So the fact that most philosophers think something, if someone thinks that's like with super duper compelling evidence, that is when I would consider that to be a problem. Now, I mentioned that some people will explicitly appeal to it as evidence and they'll qualify it in varying degrees. But a lot of times people will just appeal to it for other purposes, and those purposes can vary along a number of dimensions. In some cases, it's used in an innocuous, or you could say a virtuous or appropriate way, where you can imagine, and I've seen this, so you don't even have to imagine, you could find instances of this. You can find cases where someone will say, well, most philosophers reject moral realism and they don't endorse it at all. And then if you look at the survey results, that's not true. The 2020 PhilPapers survey found that 62% of respondents endorsed moral realism. And then if you look at specialists in metaethics, which is the area of specialization within philosophy that deals with moral realism, it bumps up slightly to 65%. So again, if someone is trying to sort of quantify over all philosophers, maybe they would say, it'd be lower than that. What it's not, though, is you're not going to find that like only 5% of philosophers or less endorse moral realism. That's just not true. So sometimes people will make assumptions or make claims about the proportion of philosophers, and they're just not aware that the data on what philosophers actually think is just totally inconsistent with their claims. So it is useful as a corrective tool for misconceptions about what most philosophers think. And in that sense, that's a totally appropriate way to use it. If someone also says, it's a little bit of evidence, it's hard to evaluate how much evidence they think that is. But I grant that it's some evidence that most philosophers think a thing. So that's also fine. But you will sometimes see it used in ways where its explicit, you could say, epistemic or evidential status is not clarified. Like it's not made explicit by the person how they're using it, but it's left to the imagination. And in those cases, I think it can function as a kind of conversation stopper, and in some cases as a kind of I guess you could say like a shame tactic. It's a way of trying to say, you're disagreeing with what the experts think, so you're not very smart, or you should submit to the authority of these experts, that sort of thing. And when it functions in that way, I think those usages, when they're not clear and precise, are inappropriate in a certain sense. The underspecificity can give other people the false or misleading impression that the implication carries greater weight than it does. And that can be leveraged for various sorts of dialectical or argumentative purposes that we should not be appealing to the evidential weight of what most philosophers think to achieve. You should not say, because 62% of philosophers think a thing, you're stupid if you don't agree with them, or you have some sort of, you're making a radical claim if you don't agree with that position. 26% of the respondents, so slightly higher, endorsed anti-realism. If you endorse a position that a touch more than a quarter of people endorse, you're in good company. And this is not a case where there's some overwhelming consensus. And the other thing about the consensus within the field is that it's far less clear that it's on some sort of stable trajectory where we can anticipate reliable convergence over time. Now, we can see the 2009 result. You had 56% of philosophers endorsing moral realism, and then that bumped up to 62% in 2020. So that looks like an upward trajectory. Maybe by the end of the century, we would have a consensus. But it's not at all clear that that's the case. One might imagine that prior to the 20th century, moral realism, if the topic had come up, might have been quite popular. I don't know. We don't have explicit data on that. But around the turn and shortly after the turn of the 20th century, moral realism largely seems to have fallen out of favor. You had the rise of positivism and the linguistic turn and Wittgenstein, ordinary language philosophy. You had a lot of these traditions where there was a turn away from the more non-naturalistic approaches towards metaethics. And moral realism seems, at least anecdotally from what I've seen of philosophers who were around at the time, to have fallen into a rather sharp decline. Then it looks like maybe around the 80s, I'd love to talk to someone with more of a historical knowledge or has been through these experiences. There seems to have been a rise of these more naturalistic approaches that attempted to render the notion of these stance-independent moral facts, moral realism, compatible with the natural sciences, and something that would be sort of acceptable on a naturalistic worldview. And then there seems to have been, shortly thereafter, a sort of renaissance of these Morean approaches to metaethics, and then moral realism seems to have had, and non-naturalist forms of it in particular, are enjoying currently a kind of renaissance. Now, is it stable? Will it persist? Is it going to stick around? And is that a permanent feature of what philosophers are going to think? I don't know. History hasn't written itself yet, so we don't know what the future has in store. So we don't know where these percentages, we don't know the sort of long-term trajectory of them. And we're not in a position of this sort of clear, concrete, cumulative case of where we're slowly building towards a particular position, and we can expect to see that kind of convergence. So that's at least one sort of preliminary reason to be rather skeptical of these sorts of appeals. So, so the PhilPapers fallacy blog idea was based on this observation that people sometimes misuse, overstate, or otherwise sort of distort the picture of what we can infer from the available empirical evidence about what most philosophers think, specifically with respect to the PhilPapers survey. But there is a more general sense in which people will appeal to the supposed authority of philosophers as evidence without necessarily explicitly or even in some sort of way of alluding to, someone might say most philosophers think this according to studies or something like that. But there are instances in which people will appeal to what most philosophers think or what philosophers generally think or that sort of thing. That's not really intended to appeal to the PhilPapers survey, but it's still intended to serve as a certain type of evidence. And so the question is basically, how much evidence should we consider it that most philosophers or any particular proportion of philosophers endorse a particular position or reject a particular position? And the latter is important because, we could do it if we look at the survey results for a particular philosophical question. It's not simply whether most philosophers endorse A over B. It's also, what if a person's proposing C as a position? And it doesn't actually matter what proportion endorse A or B. The bottom line is very few of them endorse C. And so if you're representing a position that isn't represented in any substantial way among philosophers, someone could say, yeah, that's not a very plausible position. Not because it's a position that's represented, but very few people endorse it, but because it's sort of marginal or not represented or doesn't appear in the survey response questions at all because it's that marginal. And so that you could take to count against a view where it doesn't even rise to the level that it's considered sufficiently salient and non-marginal to even appear in the surveys in the first place. On the other hand, it's possible that some of these survey responses that aren't included, because these are basically multiple choice, pick A, pick B, pick C, it's possible if you include D as an option, people would choose it. We don't know. But in many cases, it's plausible enough to infer, yeah, if you gave this additional option, not very many people are going to go for it. It's not like the people that designed the survey had no sense of what people in the field were disposed to think. Okay, so let's have a look at a few chats, and then I'll get into talking about this a bit more. Okay, so 2,500 years of philosophy history, you've never reached any consensus, or did we? That's a good question, and there are probably quite a variety of areas in which there is some consensus, but they might not be major and substantive issues. So, something like, do we have free will, that sort of thing, I doubt you're going to find much consensus. A lot of the consensus is going to be probably on issues that, because there's a consensus, they sort of just ceased being of major philosophical dispute. So what we could be seeing is a kind of, I don't know, I'll propose a new term here, attrition omission. So I like that term. So what I mean by that, by attrition omission, is that suppose that a particular philosophical issue is sufficiently well resolved that philosophers are like, yeah, we got this one. Well, if that were to occur, it might no longer be of substantive discussion to philosophers anymore. And then it's just going to drop off the radar and nobody's going to talk about it. And then it's not the sort of thing anyone's going to survey people about. If there was a philosophical issue that 99% of philosophers agreed on, or even 100%, or something like 99.99 or something like that, why bother asking about it? You already know the answer. And so what we might be seeing in the survey specifically are questions that were selected because they're controversial. And that could give the illusion of a lack of consensus when there actually is quite a bit of consensus on issues that sort of are outside of, they're not even salient anymore because there's agreement about them. So I suspect it's possible that if we could come up with issues, and again, this is a question, and this is why history of philosophy can be quite helpful in a lot of these cases. If you want to get this retrospective sense of, has philosophy made progress? I don't see how you could plausibly do that without really digging into history in a way that I simply haven't. So yeah, it's possible that there's quite a few things philosophers have made genuine progress on and come to agree about. And what we're seeing is attrition omission. It's all the things that we've resolved are omitted from the current survey, and so we're just not seeing them. But it's hard to make a judgment call there without really digging into the history. Oh, right. So here's one remark. The argument isn't expert consensus is X, therefore X is true. The argument is expert consensus is X, therefore you should go with X because there's nothing better and you have to pick something. Yeah, so if someone's making that sort of argument, if you are not a philosopher and you have judged analytic philosophers to be better than you are at making these sorts of decisions, then it might make sense to defer. I certainly do this in most of the sciences. So, if most chemists think something is 98% of chemists think something is true, I'll think, okay, it's very likely that it's true if, that pertains to chemistry. And if 70% think one view is correct and 30% think another, I would think, yeah, probably the 70% one is likely to be correct. And I'm not a chemist. I don't have enough chemistry knowledge to make those judgments for myself. So in the absence of other types of information, as a sort of general heuristic, relying on expert consensus within a field or at least the expert majority, makes a degree of sense. That's not an absurd approach to take. And if someone were to make that argument, that would be totally fine. I've also seen people make this sort of argument, and I also think this is fine. If most philosophers agree about something, you should at least take it seriously. It's worth considering. Now, there is a question of how seriously you should take it. And then there's also a question of your own degree of knowledge and expertise. What if you're within the minority view on a particular issue, but you are an expert or you are a philosopher, or you've at least looked into the issue a whole lot and you're a reasonable enough person and you've judged yourself to be good at making these sorts of assessments? Could you be wrong? Absolutely. Could you be wrong in a way that is accessible to you? Probably. So certain sorts of people that are working within these fields stand in a different epistemic relation to their peers than people that exist outside of the field. So I would be in a different position than someone that's never read anything from philosophy and has never heard about what philosophers have to say for or against a position. What you wouldn't want to see is this sort of snowball or ratcheting effect where if you're in the minority position, and this is something I've talked about before, let's say you get 60-40 on a particular issue and you put a lot of stock in what the majority thinks. Well, there's going to be a sort of critical mass for each person, like a threshold point where the evidence crosses over into them shifting their position. So if you've got 60-40 and you're in the 40 and you're at you're just on the fence about it, and you see that 60 tick up to 61, you could go, that's enough for me, and you tick over. Now it's 62-38. And then someone that's at a slightly lower threshold, we could imagine a sort of flat distribution. This is probably not psychologically realistic, but if there were a flat distribution where people's thresholds were sort of I don't know, you could just imagine a slope of a threshold where it goes down, 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 and down. As soon as these people flip, that can bump the threshold up, which makes these people flip, which bump the threshold up, which makes these people flip. And then it just ratchets you all the way to 100%, assuming that there was this distribution all the way up. So in other words, if there's a person that will change their mind if they're 61%, then you get to 62%. And then everyone that changed their mind at 62% would change their mind now at 63%. And it just brings you all the way to 100%. And maybe there's some incorrigible people at the top and you get stuck at 99. But the point would just be, if you put that much weight into it and you have that simplistic of a way of evaluating it, that's the kind of thing that you would expect to get and that plausibly you should get. Of course, the reality is going to be more complicated than that. But if the argument is simply that, in the absence of better evidence, trusting what philosophers think is better than flipping a coin, I would agree with that. But if you have sufficient metaphilosophical knowledge of the methodologies that philosophers employ, that could undermine it. So, for comparison, one of the things that matters in evaluating different fields is the degree to which you evaluate whether the people in those fields are truth tracking enough that they do better than a coin flip. And if we're talking about biology or chemistry or physics, they probably do better than a coin flip. But if we're talking about, say, astrology, they're probably not. I mean, maybe they do a little bit better than a coin flip because maybe a little bit of psychology can seep into, I don't know, astrological predictions or whatever, or they do, slightly better than chance. But they might even, judgments might even be negatively correlated in pseudoscientific or, ridiculous disciplines that don't work. And in those cases, they're not better than a coin flip. And it might actually be actively harmful to make decisions in accordance with approaches to knowledge or prediction or decision making that are not correlated with truth or are negatively correlated with truth or that underperform against the base rates of your own intuitions, for instance. So, if as long as your ability to make decisions, what should I do? Should I go left or go right? As long as your own ability to decide is better than a horoscope, you shouldn't rely on a horoscope. And all else being equal, it probably is, because astrology is a bunch of nonsense. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying philosophy is astrology. The comparison point is to compare along a continuum of the degree to which disciplines tend to be truth tracking, and we could look at the one end of the continuum where it's something ridiculous like astrology, or I don't know, reading tea leaves or something like that. And then at the other end, it might be something like mathematics or computer science, where we have very high levels of precision with are we accurate? Did we know that this worked the way that we intended? And then there's going to be things that fall on the continuum. And then the question is, where does philosophy fall in there? And it's presumably and hopefully closer to the science end than the astrology end, but there might be areas of philosophy where it's not at all clear what the methods are and how well they work and how well they're tracking the truth and how much we should trust experts. Also keep in mind that philosophy is fairly broad and there are specializations in different areas. And it might be that philosophers in certain specializations are less reliable than philosophers in other areas. So if you look, for instance, at the general philosophical view on atheism, most philosophers are atheists. But then if you look at specialists in philosophy of religion, most of them are theists. And theists, should we trust the specialists in philosophy of religion on whether theism is true? I don't know. I think that there's good reason to suspect that they self-select into the views that they have. And so, in other words, people that are already disposed towards endorsing belief in God are more likely to specialize in philosophy of religion. And in that case, they might have biases towards belief in God that are not reflected in the way other philosophers think about the issue, or how people would generally think about the issue, where you sort of to like randomly assign people to be philosophers. Okay. We got another hello. Let's see. Okay, so that was about 10 minutes ago. I want to try to keep on top of the remarks here. So let's get through. Oh, I got a bunch of these. Cool. All right. Do you think that philosophical consensus would be better evidence for a certain position than a lack of one, granted that the consensus is found in or across certain schools of thought, and that said schools of thought are mostly accepted? Well, most accepted by who? So I suppose it would wonder what types of schools, like I would have questions about what this means. One of the concerns I have with schools of thought in philosophy are whether they are sort of self-conferring their own expertise on themselves. And this is something that hopefully I'll get a chance to discuss a bit later. I mean, astrologers are going to consider themselves experts on astrology, but I don't take that to be a good reason to take astrology seriously. And so one would hopefully have some independent means or external means of corroboration in order to assess from the outside whether any particular people are really experts in what they purport to be experts in. I take, for instance, if a bunch of people say, hey, we train people to be doctors and they're good at saving people's lives, I take the evidence that they're experts at saving people's lives to be, well, do they save people's lives? I don't take it to be, do they say that they're good doctors? So in the case of philosophy, I think it's much harder to assess whether or not philosophers are experts at any particular thing. And, philosophers can probably demonstrate, for instance, that they're experts at assessing validity, that they're experts at evaluating historical questions about what particular philosophers thought. That might actually be quite hard to do, if you're engaged in that sort of interpretation. But, I mean, maybe it could be done. Presumably, there would be more or less plausible readings of earlier works in philosophy, and maybe consensus there counts in a way that it might not in other areas. I don't know what the independent means of corroboration might be. But when it comes to, do philosophers tend to have, for instance, reliable philosophical intuitions in any particular domain? I don't know. Why should we think that they have that power? And what have they done to demonstrate that they have those abilities? But hopefully I'll get into that more. Let me look at a few more questions. How many philosophers actually answer these surveys, and do they include people who do philosophy in the Southern Hemisphere? So we can have a look at the PhilPapers survey results. So let's look at the demographic results. The target group. So we have 1,785 respondents, 859 in the United States. Wow, the granting institution for PhD is 835, so it's a lot. And you would have to just look at the data. I don't know how much of it they grant. As far as Southern Hemisphere, I don't know that the hemispheric. Well, I don't know because like Australia is going to tend to get lumped in with the UK and the United States as far as a lot of this stuff goes, and same with New Zealand. So if we look, well, they measure this in different sorts of ways. They have nationality, they have country of primary affiliation, they have country of PhD institution. So there's a few ways that they looked at it. So country of PhD institution, yeah, we've got the US, then the UK, then Australia, then Canada, then Germany, Netherlands, Sweden, Spain, and then Belgium, Italy, Switzerland, and then other included 30, and then a bunch of people didn't answer that question. So yeah, not a lot of people in the Southern Hemisphere. So we don't have Africa, South America represented very well among the respondents. So like, for instance, I'm seeing nationality. I see Brazil on here has 9 people. I don't even, I see Colombia has 6. It's not a lot. And then you have United States, 859, UK, 163, Canada, 127. So you have Canada totally, I mean, compare the population of Canada, just for instance, to Brazil alone. And the representation is highly skewed towards people in the Northern Hemisphere and the Anglophone world in particular, that sort of thing. So as far as this question, yeah, it's going to be missing quite a lot of people. Yes, I am. All right. Okay, so the next thing I should say about this is the blog series is still unfolding. And so I'm probably not going to talk about every element of it just yet, but I could make a few sort of preliminary remarks about it. But for now, does anyone have any questions about where we're at so far? Definitely let me know. Okay, I have some follow-up here. I meant that if someone already accepts most of the overarching commitments of some school of thought, would a large consensus in that school of thought count as considerable evidence for that position? Yeah, so that's a good question. It's going to depend on, and this is why there's this sort of antecedent question. It's going to depend on whether the methods of that particular school of thought are legitimate or not. Do the methods actually work? So you could imagine a school of thought where the way that they approach philosophy is by flipping coins. Call it the coin flip school. It's not very creative. And then they solve every philosophical question by flipping a coin. And they all agree, they all flip coins, and they all somehow navigated towards a particular philosophical position. Or, it could be a philosophical school, there's a sort of cult of personality around certain figures, and they just agree with like the Aristotelian school. What if there's just whatever Aristotle says is correct? Well, that's going to depend on how good Aristotle was at being correct, if that's what everybody in that school of thought thinks. So there's this sort of antecedent issue in philosophy, which is how good are the methods that are underwriting how philosophers are going about forming the positions that they have. Give me one moment. Hey, I will be back in one moment. All right, I am back. All right, so we got this comment. I am from Spain. Philosophical debates are a little bit different from the Anglosphere. Well, I'd love to hear how they're different. So if you want to tell us about that in the chat, I could post that here. So I'd be very curious to hear about that. Okay, so we got this. Thanks for the response. Sorry for the poorly worded question. I ran into a character limit in writing it. Don't worry about it. You can also just split it up into multiple posts. I'm not going to get upset if you're asking like a serious question. You can also take your time. If you want to rephrase your questions, it's totally fine. So however you want to handle it, you're free to do that. If you ever want to write a longer question, and you could always email me or contact me, and I could do my best to try to answer it in a live stream. I haven't done that before, but I'm certainly willing to give it a try. But it is easier to handle shorter questions. So sometimes, you have all these clarificatory remarks that you want to make, and people can end up, and I've done this, asking really complicated, well, given this consideration, that consideration, and this consideration, and that consideration, what do you think about this? And then, you're sort of recapitulating your whole chain of reasoning that led you to ask the question. And there's too much missing context for a person to know how to handle that. So I'm not saying you're doing that. I'm saying short questions are good. Longer questions can be excellent, but you have to be careful with how you phrase them. But yeah, it wasn't poorly worded. And the character limits here are super annoying. No worries at all. But yeah, anyway, if you do have a longer question, feel free to email it to me. And what I'll probably do, because I usually do this, especially with more complicated questions, is ask a whole bunch of clarification questions. That can be pretty frustrating if your question is clear and the fault is with me and I'm not grokking it. The other thing is that I have a kind of finely tuned caution about interpreting language in straightforward ways in philosophical contexts. The reason for that is, and this has to do with my own metaphilosophical approach, is that I think a great deal of sort of subtle equivocation, misunderstanding, confusion, all sorts of things sort of creep in the back door in a lot of technical philosophical contexts. And that has to do with this constant juxtaposition between the connotations and pragmatic implicatures associated with the ordinary usages of terminology, and then the specific narrow usages that a particular person has in mind when articulating a much more theory-laden philosophical position. What I mean by that is this. Take an ordinary word like good. If you go out into the world, you will see people using the word good in all sorts of ways. People will say the food was good, the movie was good, someone is a good person, they think it's important to do good things. Someone will say, something bad happened to this person you don't like, and someone will say good. And then you can say, do you mean that? No, I don't really mean that. So people will use this word good, in all sorts of ways. And they can vary from having spiritual and religious overtones to having completely mundane overtones having to do with I don't know, how much you like food. So people could use it sarcastically. So there's all these ordinary conditions and contexts in which this word good is used. And it's sometimes used, for instance, in a moral way and sometimes in a non-moral way. And that word can carry different connotations and can imply different things about the speaker's intent and the speaker's attitudes and what's being communicated that are so context dependent that, on my view, I don't even think it makes sense to talk about, like, if you isolated or extracted all the context, what's the sort of pure semantic content of the word good. I don't think words work that way. I wanted to say I don't think words word that way. That works. I don't think words word that way. So for me, one way to put it is that it's pragmatics all the way down. It's meaning as use. It's all about context. And I think that words only have or acquire, or their meaning is constituted by their intended usage in a given context. And so any given word, especially the kinds of words that I think would be philosophically interesting, are going to have a wide variety of possible usages. And then facts about those usages are, one, an empirical question. Two, it's a highly variable question, because it's not just that there's a sort of diffuse but stable usage to any particular word like good that would be true for, like, say, all English speakers. Rather, you're going to have a wide variety of distinct linguistic subcommunities that use the word in different ways, and a wide variety of contexts that people will have greater or lesser familiarity with and engagement in. And so there's going to be a whole variety of ways in which people use the term good, that there's no easy way to pin it down. And then on top of that, language is in a perpetual state of changing. It evolves. And so you're also dealing with a sort of temporally moving target as well. So what we're dealing with if we want to pin down the meaning of a word, even a word that seems simple like good, is that one word will have dozens, possibly hundreds of usages and connotative variation and like semi overlapping ways of being deployed in different contexts. There's going to be stable variation between and across contexts, between and across speakers, between and across different linguistic communities. And then all of those are a constantly moving target because they're all evolving over time. And so these efforts to try to get at the pure meaning of words, I think would be, I mean, one, I take them to be empirical questions. Two, if they're not empirical questions, I think the questions are nonsensical because I don't think there's some intrinsic meaning to words independent of their usage. Three, even if you were to take it as an empirical question, I think it would be practically intractable to try to pin down meanings, in anything other than a sort of historical sense, because by the time you pin down a meaning in one context, you're dealing with another context or a different point in time or a different linguistic community. And so we can do this sort of retrospective analysis of how people appear to be using words more or less in any given context. But in contexts of actual context of usage, meaning has to be conveyed more holistically. It has to be understood more holistically. And we have to try to communicate in a way where we're not expecting or hoping to pin down precise meanings of particular terms. This is I think, a common misconception about my own perspective on things, because sort of, I guess the thing I might be known the most for is the unintelligibility thesis, which is the thesis that certain conceptions of reasons and other sorts of terms and concepts that are frequently employed in contemporary, mainstream, analytic meta-ethics are unintelligible. They're literally nonsensical. And you might think that I hold that view because I don't think that the proponents of these views have, for instance, laid out the sufficient and necessary conditions for the circumstances in which one would or wouldn't apply those terms, or they can't offer a precise formal definition of the terms. And I don't think that at all, because I think those are all lost causes. I don't expect anybody to be able to do this. Rather, I actually take it that they themselves are operating, in most cases, under the presumption that language works in ways that I just don't think that it works in that way. Among other characteristics, I think a lot of people think is that certain terms can be meaningful in spite of being fundamentally incommunicable. They're, in a certain sense, ineffable. And I think that these terms are candidate terms for those sorts of characteristics. Sometimes people will say, oh, well, they're primitive concepts, but often that's characterized in terms of the concepts not being capable of being broken down into two or more sort of constitutive concepts. So they're not decomposable into other concepts. But I'm not concerned with that. I'm just concerned with them being capable of communicating the concepts in a reliable, practically significant sort of way. Now, they might not think that that's a necessary condition for the concepts to be meaningful. And that's where I think a lot of the dispute is going to arise, where I expect a concept to make some practical difference if it's to be meaningful, and other people might not. And therein lies that dispute. But I do think that there's something a little suspicious, and I think we should all stand back and be a little suspicious when people will deploy terms that have some technical usage in some technical discipline, like contemporary analytic metaethics, where they'll talk, for instance, about an irreducibly normative reason or a categorical reason or something like that. And then when you ask for an account of it, they're unable to give one. Now, does it follow that if someone can't give you an account of something, that an account couldn't be given? No. And does it follow that if they can't give an account, that the concept must be meaningless or is very likely to be meaningless? No, certainly not that it's certainly meaningless. But also, it's not even that consideration alone isn't a good reason to think that it's very likely to be meaningless. This consideration, the sort of difficulty or even the inability or even the acknowledged impossibility of adequately communicating the concepts in some way that's not simply a sort of unhelpful type of attempt at ostension, or just using other terms that mean the same thing, apparently, synonymy. If all you've got is an attempt at distinction and synonymy, does that mean the terms are meaningless? No. But I think that that's one element of a broader concern that can be raised against these terms and concepts. I think other concerns need to be brought to bear. and there's other considerations that weigh on that. Let me get into the comments a bit more and see what people have to say. Thanks for the offer. Do you have your email posted somewhere on the channel? Yes, you could also find it on my blog website, and you could just like look up Lance Bush and you'll find me, so you can check it out. Yeah, the character limits. So here's the comment. The character limits here are definitely super annoying. They are. On the other hand, people would probably write essays if they could. So I agree. Thank God for the character limitation. I think ultimately it's probably a good thing. Otherwise, you get big walls of text from people. It would be cool if it was an option or a setting that we could choose, and then, or I could give someone temporary permission, but I don't know. All right. I suspected that you would ask for clarification that you do want to post the question. Yeah. Oh, okay, great. Do you not think that logical structure and syntax shape meaning too? It depends what you mean by that. I'm not really sure what you're getting at there. So you'll have to clarify. All right. So to get back to the PhilPapers thing, I had a kind of outline. Let me see if I have it written down somewhere. Yeah, I do. All right. So I had a kind of, let me see if I could post this. It might not even let me. Is it going to fit, or does it exceed character limits? We will see. All right. Let's see if this works. One second. And in the meantime, hit me with some more questions and I'll have a look at them. All right. So that looks like it split it up into two posts, and that's okay. Maybe there's an easier way to do that. But let me cover the different points, because I raised 8 points for all of these are sort of independent reasons for questioning the degree to which we should assign significant evidential weight to what most philosophers think. So let me just go through these. Oh, there was another question. Okay, cool. Thought there was for a second. So the first of these is that relevant expertise matters. So when it comes to whether or not you should trust supposed experts in a given domain, it actually matters whether they are experts in that domain. And when it comes to philosophy, there's a great deal of topics or skill sets or abilities about which philosophers might very well be experts, and I suspect that they are. This would include understanding formal logic, understanding how to assess and critically read philosophical texts, the ability to extract and evaluate arguments and assess their quality, reading difficult texts more generally, interpreting and understanding arguments, assessing validity in a formal argument. There's like domain specific knowledge that people are going to have. So people are going to be, philosophers are often going to have substantive knowledge of particular fields and of philosophy more generally. What else are philosophers good at? Philosophers might be good at limiting or suppressing certain types of considerations when making certain sorts of judgments, although I think that's an empirical question and it's hard to demonstrate. So there are quite a few things that philosophers are likely to be experts at. But the relevant question when it comes to these philosophical questions is whether the philosophers are either sort of, if it's an issue about which the matter is largely one of intuition, whether they are expert intuitors, or whether in virtue of the types of expertise that I've outlined, and perhaps some that I didn't, whether that type of expertise lends itself towards being, appreciably more reliable than other people in getting the right answer to a particular question. Now, it's plausible that it does, but then there's still the question of how much. So, research on people's ability to detect whether other people are lying shows that it's extremely difficult and people really don't do a very good job at it. And it's not like if I go and study how to detect liars, that in face-to-face interactions, I'm going to get like 99% accuracy and do way better than a coin flip. No, even with really, really, really substantive, serious training for many years, you do a little better than coin flip. And, the same thing could be true of philosophers, that all the training in formal logic in the world and all the training in the world in understanding the history of philosophy may or may not lend itself towards philosophers being disposed to being correct with respect to any substantive philosophical question. So that would be one factor here, which is that do philosophers have the relevant kinds of expertise such that they're experts at, you could say, being correct about a particular philosophical issue? And I think it's an open question whether they're experts about any particular question or in general. And I don't think that there's been good evidence to demonstrate that philosophers are experts at any particular question, that is, being correct about a philosophical question. Okay, so a related factor is what causes philosophers to have the beliefs that they do. Now, this is a bit complicated. I'm not going to go into this too much, but there are a variety of causal factors that can influence, how philosophers end up holding the positions that they have. Here would be one consideration, and this is something I asked Kane B about on Kane B's channel, which you should check out if you don't know. Kane B does a lot of philosophy videos. They're often more like structured and formal rather than this here. And so I asked this question about path dependency. Imagine if Plato and Aristotle, we had lost all their works and we'd actually instead had the works of Democritus and Epicurus. Kane B had a pretty pessimistic attitude that would make much of a difference. Maybe there's a sense in which that's a good thing and a sense maybe in which that's a bad thing. I'm not sure how much I agree. I think Kane B's considerations there were pretty cool and worth having a look at. But it's possible, I think possibly more plausible than Kane does, that certain sorts of path-dependent and sort of historical contingencies can influence the status of a particular discipline, and that this is more true of the nature of philosophy than it would be of, say, chemistry or biology. And I think that's because in the case of chemistry or biology or physics or the hard sciences, the answers that we're getting are coming from the world, and it's going to tell us what the answers are. Now, you might think that in philosophy, this is also true, that we will converge over time using our intuitions or that sort of thing. But that is itself a philosophically contentious position to take. And it may or may not be true. If it is true, maybe that is the trajectory that we're on. But it may not be, in a way that I think is more open to question than, if we lost, one way to put this is if we lost all knowledge of chemistry, like aliens wiped it from our memories or whatever, we would be able to eventually reconstruct the periodic table more or less in its present form up to a point. I mean, maybe there would be some idiosyncrasies that I'm not aware of, but the periodic table is going to be the sort of thing I think we can, in a certain sense, read off of nature, or something structurally similar in the way that it functions. Whereas, would the present philosophical emphasis that we see in contemporary analytic philosophy be the same as it is? Would the landscape of positions be the same as they are? I'm not so sure about that. It might be more subject to historical variation, and it could be a lot more contingent than that. So the causal factors involved in the present state of philosophy are going to be an important factor. The next is a type of causal factor, which is, it's not like we have a sort of representative distribution of possible psychologies that go into philosophy. Rather, instead, what we have is that psychology as a formal discipline is voluntary. And the people that choose to do philosophy may systematically differ from people that don't do philosophy in a variety of ways that are relevant to the type of philosophical view that people in the field end up endorsing. Consider, for instance, something like this. Suppose that most people that would be interested in philosophy, I take that back. Most people, were they to study philosophy, would be inclined towards a more pragmatic and empirical approach to things. Something that one might expect out of more applied disciplines like engineering or medicine or something like that. But the people that go into the field of philosophy are people that, it's zero sum up to a point with what disciplines you end up choosing and what interests you pursue and what fields you end up studying. Some people, of course, are doctors and philosophers, but there's only so much time and energy and resources people can invest in pursuing different fields. Now, if you're more inclined towards a pragmatic and applied approach to things, you might be more likely to become a doctor or an engineer. Meanwhile, people that are less disposed towards more pragmatic and empirical approaches to things are left with philosophy as a comparatively more appealing option, and so they opt to go into the discipline at a disproportionate and ultimately unrepresentative rate with respect to the psychology of humanity as a whole. And then as a result of that, what you get among philosophers are people that are more disposed towards abstract thinking, and like more abstruse metaphysical considerations. They're less concerned with pragmatic considerations. They're less concerned with applied considerations, and they're more concerned with broad theoretical stuff, less touchy-feely philosophy overall. And then they say, well, hey, look, the correct philosophical position is this one. It's not like pragmatism is stupid. Don't be a pragmatist. Well, why do they think that? Well, it could be due to a psychological disposition, a self-selection of people with that disposition to go into the profession. And, it could be that were other people to go into the profession, the distribution of people that endorse or reject a pragmatic approach or a more applied or concrete or empirical approach would differ. That, again, to what extent that's true is an empirical question. But the point there is, would the philosophical consensus or the majority on a particular position could reflect, among other things, selection effects that are not indicative of the people being correct. They're just indicative of a self-selected group of people that happen to pursue that particular issue. The prime example I'll give of this that's very clear that comes out of the PhilPapers survey is philosophy of religion. So if you go to the survey and you look at the response to like whether people are atheists or not, like whether they believe in God, you will see that a majority of philosophers, I think it's something around, 80% or something, endorse atheism or like they don't believe in God. I could look at the exact question, let's make sure we get it right. Let's look at the question. I don't know if they say they're atheists or they just don't believe in God. Let's see. Yeah, it says atheism. So what we have is 18.9% theism and 66.9%, so basically 67% favor atheism. They lean towards or endorse atheism. And then you have about 50%, it's 14.6%, chose other, and then that's split up into a variety of views. So you have most philosophers, at least the most respondents to this particular survey. I could open it up and look, 1,770 respondents, and then about 2/3 of them are at least lean towards atheism. Now, if we then look at specializations and we look at philosophy of religion, let's have a look. Suddenly it flips to 69.5% endorse theism and only about 19.9% favor atheism. So there you could say 70% theist, 20% atheist, roughly. So you see that you get this flip there. Now, so what does that tell us? Well, people that choose to specialize in philosophy of religion, it's possible that something about studying philosophy of religion causes people to become theists. But there are other possibilities. It could be that it has no effect, and it's simply that people that were already theists or more inclined towards theism are more likely to choose to specialize in philosophy of religion. It's even possible, and I post about this in the blog series, someone did an analysis. It's even possible that studying philosophy of religion decreases the likelihood that a person is a theist. And it's just that there was a high initial base rate. So for instance, what if 80% of people that specialize in philosophy of religion began as theists, and then that drops to 70% over the course of their studies? So by the time they finish their PhD, 10% of them are no longer theists. That would actually mean studying philosophy of religion causes some, or at least a greater proportion of people to become atheists than it does a proportion of people to become theists. Because keep in mind, it's not like everyone stays the same except 10% become atheists. It's that some proportion will become theists and some proportion will become atheists. And then you sort of subtract one from the other and you get the total difference in the proportion shift towards atheism. And it could be that it, say, declines by 10%. And in that case, okay, so you started out at 80% and it dropped by 10%. Should we think that like the arguments for God in philosophy of religion are super duper good? It's not clear at all. So, maybe not. We might even think the opposite of that. And so there's one interesting thing about the 62% of philosophers are moral realists. A lot of moral realists like to say, like, almost every ordinary person or every ordinary person is disposed towards realism. Let's just suppose, for the sake of argument, that were true. I don't think it is. But suppose, say, 97% of non-philosophers are moral realists. Now, again, I don't think this, but suppose that were true. And then we look at, and then let's suppose there's no self-selection effects where people disposed more towards realism or anti-realism go into philosophy. It's actually representative of the population. Again, not at all plausible. So neither of these claims are likely to be true. I don't think 97% of people are realists. I don't think that the people that choose to study philosophy, especially professionally, are going to be exactly representative of the general population. So this is purely speculative, hypothetical. Now imagine that were the case, and then we looked at the results and we saw that by the time people were survey respondents, 62% were moral realists. Well, that would seem to indicate that and let's assume, there's some sort of causal effect going on here, that would seem to indicate that a rather large proportion of people, in virtue of studying philosophy, are somehow prompted to become moral anti-realists, or at least to stop endorsing moral realism. It could be either one. That doesn't seem like that 62% is now some sort of resounding evidence for moral realism, because it looks like studying philosophy might be correcting for an initially very high bias towards, or a very high base rate at least, in favor of realism. And so it's important to consider why people become, basically causality here matters. And it's important to consider why people endorse the position that they do. Do they endorse it because they studied philosophy, or did they already endorse it before they studied philosophy? And when we're looking at the proportion that endorse a position, how much is the degree to which philosophers endorse a particular position due to them studying philosophy? That's an open question. We can't read it off just the pure proportion alone. Okay, so I said a lot there on those points. So let me see if there's been a few follow-up remarks since then. Okay, so this is going to be some complicated stuff that would be, I think, too much of a derail to get into. The language stuff is super interesting, though. So definitely let's have a conversation about that. If I have time for that, I'll try to address it. If not, if you want to come on the channel at some point, we could talk about it. You could send me an email about it, or I'll try to address it here, or you could come back next week. We'll try to work out something. But for now, I want to focus on the PhilPaper stuff, and that would be too big of a deviation. I know I deviated first by randomly talking about some other digression. And I do appreciate the comment, so I do want to come back to it. All right. Do you think that philosophy would be a second order type of knowledge? It reviews and establishes relationship with base sciences. So I think that that's a role that philosophy can play. I don't think that that's necessarily or ultimately the only role it can or should play. So yes and no. I do think that the current incentive structure in academic institutions does a big disservice to interdisciplinary and more synthetic approaches that try to build bridges between disciplines. I do think there should be more of that, but I don't think that should come at the cost of philosophy just taking the sort of auxiliary backseat role where we're just overseeing the sciences. I think that would be a great thing for philosophers to do, and for philosophers to integrate themselves in philosophy departments, I think would be awesome. And I certainly think philosophers, in fact, personally, I think it would be great if most philosophers had training in some other discipline. I do think that there's lots of space for different sorts of things. So some philosophers want to focus on history, philosophy, awesome. Some philosophers want to do like pure philosophy, also awesome. And then some philosophers, I think there could be more encouragement of and more space for philosophy to grow if it sort of had its sort of a philosophical tendrils, or that makes it sound malicious, but in a bunch of other disciplines. So I think it'd be awesome if philosophers were in biology departments and physics departments. Maybe they are in a few cases, and could work within those fields. I really love that interdisciplinary stuff. If you don't know, I mentioned that I finished my PhD. It was not in philosophy. It was in psychology. And specifically, the program was social and personality, although pretty much everybody was mostly social. So it was social psych. And so I did my training in an empirical field outside of philosophy. And I ended up doing a fair bit of work on questions related to validity and measurement and that sort of thing. Although, of course, it was related to metaethics and moral realism. But I've done a little bit on free will, a little bit on a few other topics. So, I think that's great. But I don't think it's the only or necessary function of philosophy. I don't think it should be just that. Ooh, that's a good one. Cool. I could add that to the list of possibilities. I do want to eventually, have T-shirts and stuff. I'd like to have my logo. Oh, I pointed the wrong direction. The logo. I'm really happy with how my logo turned out. So I want to have a T-shirt with that on it. I'd like to have some T-shirts and mugs and that sort of thing at some point. I still got a long way to go before I'm doing things like that. So, and then I guess I have a few other things that I tend to say that I could probably put on there. Some of them are not always the most flattering things for me to say, but what can you do? Oh, right. Got another comment here. I once met a moral realist that thought the reverse, that moral anti-realism was the common popular majority position. Yes, it's not that uncommon to hear people say stuff like that. So one of these things is like student relativism. You will see a literature on that and people talking about that. A lot of people will comment on how A lot of students in college appear to endorse relativistic or anti-realist positions. That's certainly been my experience when I've talked to students, that most of them will at least express those views. I think there's there's good grounds for skepticism about the degree to which that's reflective of any sort of substantive and committed meta-ethical position. Relativism can often be subdivided, and I think it is in the main Stanford Encyclopedia entry on it. And I've also characterized it in this way. It can be sort of broken up into relativism as a meta-ethical position, but also these more normative and descriptive claims. So the normative claim would be something like we should tolerate or not interfere when another individual or another culture has different moral standards. That's a normative claim. It's not really a meta-ethical position. And then there's this sort of descriptive claim. And sometimes people will conflate the meta-ethical stuff with that normative claim. So they'll think, well, there's no fact of the matter about which moral positions are correct, so you must tolerate everybody. And people have lampooned that as like an obvious that doesn't follow. And someone can even have this sort of self-contradictory position. And that's when you're sort of caricaturing it. Now, it's not that much of a caricature because people actually make that mistake. But meta-ethical relativism as a philosophical position, that's not built into it. That's not a feature of it. So that's not really something to be too concerned with. A lot of the criticisms of relativism, I think, are off base because they criticize these sort of popular misconceptions or conflations about it. And they take that to be some sort of decisive refutation of any and all of the strongest forms of meta-ethical relativism. And that's a mistake. And then you have this other thing of the descriptive relativism. It's not really relativism, which is simply the observation that different people have different moral standards, different cultures, different individuals. And that's just a descriptive claim about what people's moral standards are. It's an empirical claim. I suspect it's probably true. I think there's a lot of dispute about the degree to which fundamental differences in moral belief really exist, because it's possible in many cases. For instance, let's say two people both ultimately endorse some type of proto-utilitarian view where they really just want there to be the most happiness in the world and the least suffering in the world. And then they just have different beliefs about the non-moral facts. So facts about what actions, what policies, what decisions would in fact increase happiness and decrease suffering. And so they end up coming down differently on different moral issues, like applied ethical issues, what policy to endorse, what law to pass, how much taxes to have, how to punish crime. They could disagree on those issues, but they're disagreeing because they have different beliefs about the non-moral facts, and then that's causing them to disagree on the sort of applied questions. But if you really got down to it and they talked to one another, they'd realize they're both trying to maximize utility. And so in a certain more fundamental sense, they actually don't disagree on morally what we ought to do. They actually have similar moral standards. So do they have moral disagreements? Well, it depends what you mean by moral disagreement. If you mean, do they disagree on the applied practical questions of how to implement one's moral standards? The answer is trivially yes. We just stipulated that they do. Do they have fundamental moral disagreements? That is, do they have fundamentally different normative moral standards? No. Again, it just turns out that they don't. And so it's an open question, the degree to which any putative dispute about a moral issue comes down to a disagreement over non-moral facts versus a disagreement about moral facts. Anyway, so those are the three types of relativism: meta-ethical, normative, and descriptive. Descriptive and normative, in a certain sense, aren't like actual relativism, although whatever, it's not that important what terminology we use as long as we're clear and we're precise. And a lot of people conflate them. And it could be that many of the people that are espousing relativism and these sort of non-academic, or at least outside of like formal professional philosophy, that there is some sort of, they're dealing with a kind of grab bag of those, and they're intending to convey these other sorts of characteristics, and not so much this sort of more precise, narrow meta-ethical position. So it's unclear, but yeah, some people might take it to be that most people are anti-realists. My own view is called meta-ethical indeterminacy. So I think that for the most part, ordinary people don't have or use moral terms in a way that they don't have substantive meta-ethical positions, and they don't use moral language in a way that commits them to substantive meta-ethical positions. I don't think people are realists or anti-realists. And yes, it's possible to be neither of those. You don't have to have a stance, and you don't have to use language in a way that determinately fits one or another of these positions. To give a couple examples, I'll give an example from Michael Gill, who is the first person I know of to articulate indeterminacy as a position. And then you have Loeb and Gill, who have articulated this view that people might have multiple positions. Gill puts forward this account called variability, where it could be that some people, determinately use relativist language, some people determinately don't. And it could be that the same person uses relativist language in some contexts and not in others. That's variability. And then Loeb proposes incoherentism, which is that you could have variability, but it's actually at the same time and in the same context. So a person can have sort of simultaneously conflicting commitments. They mean something to be both relativist and not relativist. And in that case, the moral claim in question, like murder is wrong, if it commits the person both to relativism and the rejection of relativism, the position's incoherent, and hence incoherentism. And that gives you a special type of irrealism or anti-realism, where people could have in commitments that just don't work. They're incoherent. That would be a bit like someone saying, whenever I say this, I'm presuming the existence of square circles or something. The thing in question is both a square and it is not a square at the same time in the same respect, which of course is nonsensical. So those are a variety of positions. I tend to favor mostly indeterminacy for various sorts of theoretical and empirical reasons. Can't get into all of those now, but I do think it's certainly possible that there are linguistic subcommunities or individuals that do use determinate meta-ethical language in certain sorts of pockets of discourse that is determinate and does commit people. The comparison I prefer, sorry, I was going to give a Gill's comparison. Gill compares variability and indeterminacy as these hypotheses for the best account of ordinary moral language. That paper was written before a lot of the empirical work was done. It was just kind of starting at the time. So Gill compares this to mathematical Platonism. So, just think of two people talking about numbers. Someone's like, hey, you're adding up a tip. The tip is $12.22. When that person says that, or when they're adding numbers and, they're thinking, they're adding up numbers in their head, are they committed when they say, it's $12.22 to Platonism or anti-Platonism in particular? I think it's a ridiculous question. They're not committed to either. Ordinary language, as Gill makes a point, it's just not in the business of dealing with that sort of question. My preferred comparison isn't so much to philosophy, but to scientific theories. So I favor comparing ordinary moral language when talking about meta-ethical indeterminacy to quantum mechanics. So take everyday causal claims. Person says, hey, I think it's going to rain tomorrow. And then their friend is like, I don't think it's going to rain tomorrow. Did you check the forecast? Oh, yeah, I did. Oh, well, and then they start arguing about it. It doesn't really matter. The point is, when people are making causal claims, which account of quantum mechanics are they committed to? Because these events are going to involve material, like physical events to take place that are going to involve quantum events to occur where there's going to be like a collapse of a wave function. So how do they interpret quantum mechanics when they make these claims? Are they presuming a Copenhagen interpretation where there's going to be some degree of randomness or indeterminacy in the events that happen? Or are they, endorsing a many worlds interpretation where the universe is splitting into multiple, it's going to be constantly branching into other universes? Do they endorse some sort of, hidden variable view where they think it's ultimately deterministic? I think the question is ridiculous. They don't endorse any of these, and they certainly don't explicitly endorse them. Most people, because they've never thought about it and they're not aware of these positions, and they're not implicitly committed to one of these positions. The way that they're speaking just doesn't require a stance on these issues. It's not what the language is doing. It's not what the language is for. So you have that as a potential point of comparison. On the other hand, are there some people that are not professional practicing physicists that have went and picked up some books on, they're autodidacts, or they've had a discussion with a physicist, or they're married to a physicist, or whatever, that exposes them to enough of these interpretations that they do take a stance on it and they do understand it and they do speak in a way where if you're like, yeah, do you mean this particular view? And they're like, yeah, that's what I mean. And they mean it and they know what they're talking about. Some people are going to be like that. Now, you might say they're excluded from lay people or non-philosophers, or in this case, you could say non-theoretical physicists or something, in virtue of having sufficient understanding to know what they're talking about. That could come down to a definitional question. But the point there is just that those instances are probably, in practice, going to be very rare. Now, the picture could change. It could be that in the future, with advanced super technology, we all study quantum mechanics and everybody knows about it, or it becomes, I don't know, a quantum mechanics overlord takes over the world and forces everybody to study quantum mechanics. And then the picture would change. Could then be that everybody endorses the Copenhagen interpretation. But I don't think, as a matter of empirical fact, we are in that state with respect to metaethics. I take moral realist and anti-realist positions to be largely philosophical inventions that are not reflected in any explicit way in the way that most ordinary people think. And I don't think that it's really necessary or useful to attribute these characteristics, or I guess you could just say descriptively accurate, to say that when a person says murder is wrong, it best fits with a realist or anti-realist philosophical framework. Now, there's going to be people that are going to dispute this. They're going to say, well, a lot of people say, well, hey, Lance, you're an anti-realist, but you're making moral judgments, so you must be a realist. That's absurd. I also make judgments about which food is good or bad. I'm not a gastronomic realist. So the fact that I make normative and evaluative judgments does not mean I'm a realist about that domain of discourse. I don't think the mere fact that just structurally moral claims look like propositions means that they are propositions or that they're intended to describe stance-independent facts. I don't take that to be decisive at all. I also don't take other sorts of semantic armchair considerations to be particularly compelling either. Okay, I've said a lot on that. So got another question here. Would you consider philosophy detached from sciences to be just armchair speculation? For example, talk about morality without mentioning psychology and sociology. It really depends on the question. So if sometimes philosophers will do armchair speculation about empirical questions. And in that case, yeah, it can be speculative. Some philosophers, Stitch would be one example, Bashery is another example. They're philosophers, but they're not just engaged in armchair speculation. They go and they read the empirical research or they conduct empirical studies and they integrate that into the philosophical theses that they defend. So some philosophers do that, have this more synthetic and interdisciplinary approach. And in that case, it's not speculation. So you have that. And then in other cases, the questions are ones that either are, I should just say, they're at least intended by those engaging in them to not be empirical questions. And so in that case, I wouldn't say that they're engaged in armchair speculation. They might be addressing questions that I think are unanswerable or unintelligible because they might be attempting to answer questions that I think are based on misconceptions about language or meaning, but they don't think that. And I'm not going to, it would be question begging to just say, well, they are doing what I like, given that my view is correct, then what they're doing is bad armchair empirical research. They're not taking themselves to do that. So I'm not going to attribute that to them. That's not what they intend to be doing. And so, no, I don't think all philosophers are doing that. Well, you didn't say all. Let's look at the question. Yeah, so some, I think, are doing armchair speculation, and they're doing it quite badly in many cases. I have criticized philosophy, what some philosophers do. I've sometimes said that philosophy is often psychology with a sample size of one. And what I mean by that is that philosophers often will make empirical claims, or what at least appear to be empirical claims, and they primarily rely on their own introspection. They're doing introspective psychology. I think that's super unreliable and quite terrible. And I do think that there are philosophers that do see appeals to their intuitions or introspection or whatever it is that, that their semantic judgments about cases. They don't have to necessarily characterize them as intuitions. And they don't necessarily have to think of intuitions as any type of autonomous or sui generis or some special type of method. So someone like Williamson might say, yeah, what I'm doing is empirical, but I do think I'm in a good position to make these sorts of judgments. So in those cases, I think they're doing armchair judgment. It doesn't have to be speculative. It's an empirical question whether those armchair judgments are reliable. In some cases, they might be. I think in practice, they almost never are. And I think that's for various sorts of empirical reasons, which I'll get to. But I'll just say very quickly, most of the philosophers that are doing this sort of thing are operating within the analytic tradition. They're predominantly trained in a particular tradition that comes from weird cultures. That's Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic cultures. These particular cultures are psychologically idiosyncratic, and so I don't take their judgments to be representative of people's judgments in general. I think there's a degree of cultural constructedness to their judgments, and it's unclear how reliable those judgments are, and it's unclear the degree to which those judgments are reflective of any sort of accurate judgments about what the world is like, rather than judgments that are sort of idiosyncratic and may or may not be reflective of what the world is really like. I do think philosophers will there's just so many moral realists and I guess anti-realists alike. Error theory would be a good example of this. Do seem to me to make claims about how ordinary people think that do appear to be speculative and are not sufficiently tied into the empirical literature. This varies by degree. I think if you looked at J.L. Mackey's work on error theory, you're going to get a lot less empirical work. And to be fair to Mackey, there wasn't a whole lot, arguably at the time. At least there's a lot less than there is now. Moral psychology as an empirical discipline, especially more robust cross-cultural research. Shouldn't even say robust. There's been a bit more, but not anywhere near enough. Almost all psychological research has been conducted largely within weird populations, even though they only make up something like, I think, 12% of the world's population. It's almost all of the research. And then almost all of the researchers themselves are from weird populations, tend to work in those populations, tend to write in English, which is like a prototypically weird language. By weird, I'm using it in this acronym sense. It's all capitals: Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic. This is just to say that they tend to come from certain demographic populations that are, on average, psychologically different from other populations. It's not to say any particular individuals in these populations exhibit any of these particular characteristics picked out by the acronym. So this is really about population level differences. It's not about the characteristics of particular individuals. So of course you're going to get a lot of individual variation. In any case, yeah. So to answer the question, some of them I think it's speculative, some of them it's not. As a quick answer. All right, another question. Wouldn't you say that when it comes to moral realism in the population, we can at least safely assume many believe in divine command theory? I don't know. So I think what would happen if you ask people is they just wouldn't be sure about whether divine command theory is best classified as a realist or anti-realist position. I don't think non-philosophers are going to know. And I think it's a matter of contention among philosophers themselves. So I don't know the answer to that question. I do have an upcoming blog post because of a whole bunch of stuff. I should say, I wrote so many blog posts while I was waiting on things being in order for me to really start digging into this, that the blog is going to be very active. I already have at least 3 posts scheduled per week for the whole rest of the week. So that's 12 posts coming up for the next 4 weeks. There's going to be stuff that I come up with sporadically on occasion here or there. So you're going to see more. I have a few new features and stuff on there. So one of them is the PhilPapers thing, but I've got a lot more. And I have an upcoming blog post that'll probably be out in 2 or 3 months. I got a big backlog of stuff I've written that goes through claims that, well, most people are theists, therefore most people are realists. This is a bit different of a question than that. But I address that question. And that question is at least close enough to this that what I say about that is probably relevant to this question. But I don't think that the fact that people are theists means that they're divine command theorists. And I don't think that it means that they're realists or anti-realists. That's not what you were asking, but I don't think theism entails realism, in other words. And I don't even think it's necessarily that closely associated with it. Yeah, and then, of course, divine command theory, as I said, it's not even clear. Is that realism or anti-realism? It depends how you frame it, probably. So, like I think the crude answer is, well, it's just a type of anti-realism because it's saying that moral facts depend on God's standards, so it has stance dependence. It's not indexical, so it's not a type of relativism, but it would be closer to something like ideal observer theory, and so it's ultimately a type of anti-realism. On the other hand, some proponents of something like divine command theory, or just they would call it that, are going to say, oh, it's not that simple, and there's these other factors going on. Then they're going to say there's going to be substantive cynicism, which is different because, among other things, the moral facts might be in a certain way. They're not contingent. They're not arbitrary. They're not subject to God's whims. So God couldn't just be like, I just feel like murder is okay, and then that would make murder okay. In the way that would be true of certain forms of relativism, where if I got hit in the head and woke up tomorrow and thought murder was okay, then on a relativist account, it would be okay relative to my standards. So it doesn't have those qualities. And so people might want to say, well, look, technically it might be a type of anti-realism, but it sure looks like a type of realism. And also do keep in mind, it's an open question, and there's not like a fact. Well, it's not even an open question. There's no fact of the matter about precisely how to characterize the distinction between realism and anti-realism. I prefer a very simple cutoff, which is, does it say that the moral claims are stance dependent or stance independent? But even that can get more complicated because someone could ask the question, well, what do you mean by stance dependent or stance independent? And I got to admit, that's a tough question to answer. I can give a kind of superficial answer, but I'm not satisfied with it, and I don't think anybody else should be. So I certainly don't think that this is like a very, I don't know if it's a very, but it's an unsatisfying and not complete distinction, and many people would not want to draw the distinction in the way that I would. So some people would want to include certain cognitivistic accounts in their accounts of realism. They're going to say some minimal type of realism is just any view which holds that there's moral facts. It doesn't matter if they're stance dependent or not. And in that case, certain types of relativism would be included as a type of realism. Other people are not going to like that, and there's no fact of the matter. This is a matter of terminological convention. It's up to us how we want to draw the terminological boundaries. I think that this is a practical question about what would be the sort of least confusing and most useful way of carving up the terminological territory. But we always have to be mindful not to conflate the terminological distinctions that we draw with the actual content. This is a bit like a distinction between, imagine you had a bunch of objects. Let's just go with fruits because that's easy. Apples, bananas, pineapples, mangoes, all the fruits, right? So you got a bunch of fruits, and then you have a bunch of boxes, and then you have like little labels you could stick on them. The question we're asking, is this a type of realism or not, is not a question about what type of fruits we have. Do we have 3 bananas or 12 bananas? Do we have a mango or not? Do we have any dragon fruit? It's not a question about what there is. It's just a question about how to label things. That's all that it is. It's just a question of, should we put all the citrus in one box, or should we split it up into, I don't know, this type of citrus and that type of citrus, like sweet citrus and more sour citrus. So the limes and lemons go together and the oranges go in a different box. That's a practical question. It doesn't change the nature of oranges, limes, and lemons. They're still exactly what they are, and nothing about which box you put them in differs. So is this a type of realism or is this a type of anti-realism? Practical question. There's no fact of the matter. Okay, so where was I at in my list? I think I was on selection effects. Okay, so let's move through a few more of these. And it looks like I'm going longer than I expected to today, and I guess that's okay. But give me a moment. I'm going to take a quick break. If you have other questions, please let me know. Also, start shouting at me if I forget to unmute myself. Give me one moment. All right. I'm back. Just a quick break. So where was I at? Where's my list? Okay. So interpretation of the PhilPapers questions matters. That's the next one on the list. So far, just to recap, we have relevant expertise matters, causality matters, selection effects matter, interpretation of the questions matters. Now, there's a few things to say about these questions. If you look at these questions, you'll see stuff like this. Where is the question itself? Let me go back. It suddenly doesn't want to load because I'm in the middle of trying to talk about it. So of course it's not going to work. Well, I'll just show you these. So I see this question. I don't know exactly how it looked to survey respondents. So if you were one of the official respondents to the survey and the questions were more detailed or more complex, please let me know. But what I'm seeing here is you just have meta-ethics, moral realism, or moral anti-realism. Now, I just got finished pointing out that different people characterize the distinction differently from one another. And so what that can lead to when people are answering this sort of question is what I call interpretive variation, which is exactly what it sounds like. Variation in how people interpret something. And this is something that has been understudied and underappreciated in psychological research. I'm sure that there is methodological discussion of it in like methods journals and among statisticians and people that care about validity and measurement. But I very rarely see psychologists in practice discussing this or bringing it up or raising it as an issue. And the reason I say that is because I bring it up and I focus on it. So I really care about how people interpret questions. So for me, it's really a big deal. What do people think the question is asking them? And if a question is ambiguous or difficult to interpret, you could get interpretive variation. And what that results in is if you interpret a question one way and I interpret it another way, and then we answer the question, what we're doing is we're answering structurally or formally what looks like the same question, but since we've interpreted the content of the question differently, we're really effectively answering different questions. And so now when you compare the results, they're not really commensurable in the way that one might want them to be, were we to answer the same question. You no longer can compare what I think about X to what you think about X, because you asked me a question using quote X, but I interpret it in way Y and you interpreted it in way Z. So now we know what I think about Y and what you think about Z. Now the problem is we also don't have direct access unless we ask or we find out how people interpreted the question. And so when you get a distribution or a variation in people's responses to a question, it will hopefully, and in most cases for well-designed surveys, in practice actually reflect differences with respect to the same or approximately the same question. But if there's substantial variation in interpretation, you're going to have a noisy measure. What I mean by that is that at least some of the responses are not reflective of what it is you're trying to measure, what you're trying to capture with what you're asking, because the differences are actually due to different interpretations rather than different responses to this, what in practice is the same question. So interpretive variation matters. Now, you can imagine someone looking at this question about moral realism and anti-realism and going, well, I'm a constructivist. I like to think of myself as a moral realist, so I'll pick, yes, moral realist. Another person looks at this and they're a constructivist and they go, well, I'm a constructivist and I like this characterization of moral realism as this view that, among other things, holds that moral facts are stance independently true. I don't technically think they're stance independently true. I don't think my position is as arbitrary or contingent or suffers from the kinds of problems that relativism or expressivism or error theory has. I'm a constructivist. I'm a constructivist for a reason. I don't like the problems those positions face, but I also don't technically think I'm a realist, and I don't think it would be accurate to characterize myself in the same category as like people that have like a Morean, more non-naturalist perspective. So I'll pick anti-realist because that's technically accurate. And so now you have two people that have the same position, but interpreted the question differently. They drew the line towards what's a realist and anti-realist differently. How many people did that in response to this question? I have no idea. I don't know. I bet it's not. I will go so far as to say I would bet it's not negligible. I bet it's at least a small percentage. Like a small percentage where we'll go, oh, wow, now that we know how people interpreted it, and now we can sort of readjust the percentages in light of that, this looks quite a bit different. Now, is it going to switch from 62-26 to like most people are anti-realists? No, it's probably not. Although we could look at the amount of constructivists, and if we wanted to categorize them all as anti-realists, maybe it would change a lot. I'm open to that possibility, but I don't think so. I think this is probably roughly in the ballpark. I think it probably is the case that 2-to-1 realists and anti-realists, and then the rest not really fitting into those categories. Plausible. I don't sit around all day talking to philosophers. I don't travel all around talking to them all over the place. So maybe I don't have the best sense of this. I think it would be an interesting question to ask, what do your colleagues think, or what do you think other philosophers think, alongside questions like these? And something I'd really like to do is a more targeted survey about meta-ethics to professional philosophers and see what they think. So how they interpret the questions matters, and this applies across the whole survey. So it's not just about the meta-ethics question. One thing I wanted to point out is if we look at aesthetics, let's look at that. So for for meta-ethics, we got moral realism and anti-realism. But for aesthetics, we got objective or subjective. Well, is it different terminology? And those terms might be taken to mean different things. I think that the designers of the survey addressed this, and apparently specialists, I think, thought that framing was better with respect to that particular question. So there might be, and I'm going to just grant that there's likely a good reason why the terminology is different for this question than for that question. But terminology matters, and people that might say that they endorse objectivism might not say they're a realist, or vice versa. And someone that might endorse anti-realism might not say they endorse subjectivism. So if you ask me in a survey, am I a moral anti-realist, I would say yes. If you ask me, do I think morality is objective or subjective? Well, I'd probably pick other, because I don't think it's subjective. So I would say neither. So the way I would answer those questions differs. So if I were answering this question, my answer falls into the other category. I don't choose subjective, but I would choose anti-realist. So the precise wording of these questions matters, and how people interpret the questions matters. And so we might get a skewed picture. It's not going to be decisive or totally overturn everything of the results of the survey on the basis of considerations about language and interpretation. Okay, so the next one. This is a big one. And I guess the last few of these are quite a bit bigger, and I don't want to spend too much time on them. But independence matters. So imagine that you were just looking at the raw proportion of philosophers that endorse a position, and anybody that is a professional philosopher or knows enough knowledge of philosophy or whatever gets to answer the survey. Now imagine it's, 1,000 years in the future. And one philosopher, let's say it doesn't even matter what the view is. Let's say they're a utilitarian. Now, if you currently look, consequentialism is not a super popular position. It's only about, I think, 1/3. Well, let's look it up. I like to be precise. Consequentialism is 30.56%. So if you look at the results for that, it's 32% deontology. We'll say 30% consequentialism and about 37% virtue ethics. and then about 34% choosing other. So that adds up to a lot more than 100. So apparently people are all, people are going to pick overlapping categories there. Yeah, because I'm realizing as I'm reading, it's like, what is it, like 130% of respondents? What? If you look at those results, consequentialism is the broader category in which utilitarianism falls. So the proportion of utilitarians is going to be somewhat under that. So let's say that's the same 1,000 years from now, just for the sake of simplicity. And it's really only like, I don't know, 5 or 10% utilitarians. But one utilitarian really wants utilitarianism to win. Or they just, I don't know, it doesn't matter what their motives are. But let's say that they go to another planet with a bunch of cloning technology. And they're not just like clones where you have a baby that's genetically almost identical to you. Rather, you have it like it's an exact copy. So they have like a really awesome 3D printer or like a teletransporter thing from Star Trek, and it teleports you, but they don't even teleport themselves. They just keep making copies, right? And so they use this, and it's a planet. I don't know. Let's say they terraformed it so it has plenty of resources, and they populate it with 100 billion copies of themselves who all endorse utilitarianism. And then the 30/20 PhilPapers survey rolls around, and almost everyone answering the survey is a copy of that person. Let's say the person is Alex. So we've got Alex 1, Alex 2, Alex 3, all the way up to Alex 100 billion. They just decide to go with numbers. So now 99.99999% or whatever of respondents to the survey choose consequentialism or utilitarianism. Should we judge that position is most likely to be true? Because I mean, look at that case. We have a massively overwhelming consensus in favor of that view. Must be true. Must be true. Overwhelming consensus. And they could just answer all the PhilPapers survey questions. So apparently we resolved every question in philosophy because we just copied one person until they just swamp every category. Is that reasonable? What do you think? Okay, I should do a poll in the community section of this at some point, but hopefully people, or if you're at home, you thought about it. Presumably the answer is no, like at all. Like that would be ridiculous, right? And part of the reason for that is that none of these thinkers have came to their conclusions independently of one another. And so you have a kind of garbage in, garbage out scenario where if a mistake was made at any point in the chain of reasoning that led that particular person to be a utilitarian, that mistake would be recapitulated or copied in every copy of themselves. And so it would just be multiplying the same mistake over and over and over. So that isn't going to be any better evidence than just one of them. And so what you have there is a perfect lack of independence for all of those judges. Now, of course, once the copies are made, they might start thinking differently, and maybe a few will change their minds and they'll start diverging. But at the point, let's say you copy them, you keep them all like cryogenically frozen, and then you thaw them right at the moment the survey is released, and they haven't had a second to think about anything. You just immediately, the first thing they do is answer the survey, right? We can make this hypothetical ridiculous. Then there's no divergence. They're all exact copies of one another. And if that doesn't work, just imagine that we have brain emulations that are like literally exact, like line by line digital copies of the same thinker, right? So if I have an AI that endorses utilitarianism and I just create 1 trillion copies of it and have them answer the survey, is that good evidence that utilitarianism is true? No, it's not. Now, what that's supposed to do is illustrate that the more independent those thinkers are of one another, all else being equal, the more we could take them as sort of triangulating at the truth by approaching it from, I guess you could say, different angles. I'm being a little metaphorical here. But the point here is just that in practice, the degree to which, at least part of the degree to which we should put stock in what philosophers think about a given issue is the degree to which their judgments are independent of one another, whether they're independently considering things and there isn't overlap in the trainings or sort of repetition of the biases or mistakes that are causing any one of them to think the same things as any others of them. Social factors could cause some people to feel a certain degree of social pressure to conform to a more popular position. That is not necessarily in and of itself a good reason to endorse a view. It could be that, in other words, well, I should say there's a bunch of other factors here. It's not, in other words, nothing. A bunch of other factors here. People tend to read the same books. If errors are in those books, they'll have exposure to the same errors. People will be exposed to the same arguments. If there's errors on those arguments, they'll be exposed to the same arguments. People will be exposed to the same events, conferences, readings. They're operating on similar psychologies. They tend to interact with one another. You know, as another point of comparison, let's say you get to the scene of a crime and you have 10 witnesses. all at different points, and none of them have spoken to, saw, or interacted with one another at all, and you take them all and interview them separately, and they all report the same event, versus 10 witnesses that are all standing together and they're all dressed the same, and they all look like they know each other very well, and they all report the same event, exactly the same as before. Would you put the same or less stock in their testimony? Probably less, because it could be that they collaborated with one another to come up with a false story, or that they are similar to one another in ways that they're at the same vantage point. So if they made a mistake, they all made the same mistake. There's a variety of reasons why the lack of independence of those witnesses undermines the degree of evidence compared to the more independence. And so when philosophers are steeped in the same education, training, traditions, and when they interact with one another, that weakens the degree to which their judgments are independent of one another, and the degree to which they offer sort of triangulating evidence of what's correct. So that's not decisive. It doesn't mean that there isn't sufficient independence among philosophers for them to, it's not just a case like exact copies of a person's mind. Obviously, philosophers are quite a bit different from one another and can think independently of one another, but there's a sort of, at least some sort of, I guess you could say, cognitive overlap. And that weakens that evidence at least a little bit. And so you can see what I'm doing here. I'm trying to build a cumulative case for skepticism about the degree to which we should rely on what philosophers think. Okay, so the next one is, this is a very short one, and there's not a whole lot I could say about it. It's an issue to look into more, but it's more a question of history and like the sociology of philosophy, which I don't know enough about to comment substantively on, but I'll raise it as a suspicion, which is that philosophical fashions matter. And I did talk about this very early on, that at like in the mid 20th century, moral realism seemed to be sharply on the decline and was rather unpopular. Then it seemed to, naturalism surge in popularity, Cornell realism being one of these like very seemingly popular positions, and then non-naturalist realism more recently. And what I suspect is that topics in philosophy are often come and go as a matter of sort of sociological forces. There's sort of just winds and climactic changes. They're not reflective of any smooth trajectory towards the top of some mountain of truth, but rather it's just sort of drifting in the ocean in a certain sense. And so there could be a degree to which what particular perspective is popular at any given time is due to factors unrelated to truth and have more to do with sort of local, contingent historical features of the sort of current trends within a field or within philosophy more broadly. There's not much more I could say about that, but it is a point of concern that I think it's an open question, the degree to which philosophy is a matter of fashionability. So I'll just flag that as a concern. The next one I've already talked a little bit about, which is number 7, demographic, social, and cultural forces matter. So I'll be very brief on this. The vast majority of philosophers, especially respondents to the PhilPapers survey, but more generally operating within the analytic tradition, they tend to come from populations, weird populations, that research has shown. So this goes back to a paper called The Weirdest People in the World by Hinrich Hein and Norton Zion, where what they pointed out is that most participants in psychological research are from weird populations. And in particular, a lot of them are college students, often freshmen in undergraduate courses that are filling out studies for credit. And in particular, many of them are undergraduates majoring in psychology or taking psychology courses. So you're sort of prototypical or sort of exemplar of the kind of participant that you have would be a 18 or 19-year-old freshman in the United States that's taking an intro to psychology course at a major university. That would be the typical person in a psychological study. So then the question is, how well do people like that represent human beings in general? The answer is not very well at all. So it turns out that people from Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic nations tend to not be particularly psychologically representative along numerous psychological dimensions with respect to the rest of the people in the world. Now, are they similar in many, many respects, possibly most respects? Probably, or at least maybe. But for any given psychological characteristic, there is sufficient variation in general that has been documented and demonstrated with cross-cultural research for it to be plausible to be skeptical. We don't get to just presume that the way that college students in the US think reflects the way everyone everywhere thinks for any given issue. Now, already then, psychology gives us this distorted, unrepresentative picture of human thought. But keep in mind, weird populations, a big factor that makes them weird is the Western element, that there's this particular cultural differences between predominantly more Western populations. Of course, there's not a sharp cutoff here, but more Western populations versus less Western or Westernized populations, or populations that have less Western influences. So you already have that factor among participants in studies, but keep in mind who philosophers are and what philosophers, and I should say analytic philosophers. Analytic philosophy is a distinctively weird branch of philosophy. And so you're taking people that, for the most part, most of them come from weird populations. But even if they didn't, even if you took people from all over the world to study analytic philosophy, they would still be then studying philosophy in a tradition in which virtually all of the readings are from people from, I mean, almost by definition, it just is a type of Western philosophy, predominantly within the Anglophone tradition. So you're going to be reading a lot of philosophy in English by people from the UK or the United States. And they're at the very least going to be massively overrepresented relative to the world population. You're going to get tons and tons and tons of British philosophers to a degree that is totally unrepresentative of the human population. So you getting a distinctively British and American perspective in a way that's very disproportionate. Now, does that matter? Yes, it does, because these populations are the most weird of the weird populations. And then these are people that are thinking within the very traditions that are reflective of that mindset. So what you, in a certain sense, you could say that analytic philosophers, or you could say the Western philosophical canon represents, so actually, let me take a step back. Weird populations are already outliers, psychologically speaking. Philosophers writing within the analytic tradition are, like, you could say, extra weird. So they're not just weird, they're sort of like prototypically weird. They tend to come from the United States and the UK, and they tend to be operating within a particular academic and intellectual, like this narrow sphere. And so in a certain sense, they are even more idiosyncratic. Now, that could be in the direction of being more weird with respect to weird attributes, but it could also be characteristics that are distinctive to the analytic and Western philosophical traditions. And so they're not just like extra weird. They're also like, in other words, if you took like a random person in the United States and a random person from somewhere in the rest of the world, or like random, like a sampling, for, random 100 people from the US and a random 100 people from the rest of the world, the people from the US would not be particularly representative of the rest of those people. They'd be psychologically idiosyncratic. Now, it could be that philosophers themselves and the people that have written in the history of philosophy would be even like, they'd be at the extreme end of people from weird populations with respect to the relevant psychological differences. So you could say that they're like extra weird, but they would also be different in other sorts of respects in virtue of the distinctive and unique like characteristics of analytic philosophy as a subculture. And in that respect, they would be sort of, we could say like different or divergent along some other dimension. And so there'd be these sort of two, you could say, perpendicular or orthogonal dimensions, according to which the people that we're reading when we study philosophy are different. And in that respect, you could say that they're already, because they're like probably more weird than the average weird person, they're outliers among outliers in that respect. And they're different in that they're inculcated in a particular subculture. And so they're outliers among outliers among outliers. And then things get even worse, because philosophy is this cumulative discipline in which it's not like when you go into it, you're just immediately steeped in that history. And so then you are trained to think in that way. And so the people in philosophy are, if you randomly sampled one, you're most likely to get a person, say, from the United States, that studies work from people from the United States and the UK, that's from a culture that's already psychologically idiosyncratic. And so then you yourself are inducted into this idiosyncratic subculture from an idiosyncratic demographic population that is that is from a broader population that is idiosyncratic with respect to the rest of the world. So what you're dealing with here among philosophers, the way that they think about the world, is that they are, psychologically speaking, outliers among outliers among outliers among outliers. I mean, you're talking about one of the most idiosyncratic populations, psychologically speaking, of anyone anywhere in the history of humanity. And these people are the ones that think that they can extrapolate from the way they think when introspecting to the way that everyone thinks, not just now, but through all time and all history, and even non-humans. So many moral realists would say things like, if we ran into extraterrestrials, they would converge on the same judgments and intuitions as us. They would share the same views as us. So that reflects a conception about what you take your mental faculties to be doing that treats them as having a capacity for transcending the cultural influences that structure your way of thinking. And I don't think that philosophers have seriously considered in a way that I think is sufficient to reflect on how plausible that actually is and how reflective that actually is of what we can infer given the psychological literature. I don't even think philosophers do a good job of inferring what other people in the United States think when they're in the United States, much less what other humans think, and even less what humans in the past thought, much less what non-humans would think. I think they have no idea. And what's weird about philosophers is they will generalize from the way they think to how everyone thinks with virtually no empirical evidence to support such claims. It's absolutely baffling. And so when you see the responses to these survey results, what you are seeing is a population for which we have no good reason to believe they're psychologically representative of what human beings would think, were you just sort of randomly draw from, let's say you randomly drew 1,700, whatever the total amount was, from the world, and you trained all those people to be professional philosophers, and then you surveyed them with all the different cultural and historical backgrounds, and you did not have them only read, or I guess I shouldn't say only, but predominantly be exposed to, if you go through undergrad and grad school, Plato, Aristotle, Hellenistic philosophers, Aquinas, medieval philosophy, early modern, late modern, 20th century philosophy, people are going to read the same stuff. They're going to read Plato, they're going to read Aristotle, they're going to get to Descartes, they're going to read Leibniz, they're going to read Spinoza. Anybody that has studied analytic philosophy will recognize these names. And then they're going to get to the 20th century and they're going to get Lewis, or they're going to get, I don't know, just the ones that, weird ones are going to come to mind now that I'm being self-conscious about it, but like, I don't know, Carnap, Quine, Wittgenstein. Particular people are going to come to mind for whatever reason. So you're going to get exposure to these particular people who are predominantly operating within particular traditions. Now, do people in the United States, when they're going to grad school and taking undergrad, get some exposure to continental philosophy, some exposure to, philosophy from around the world? Yeah, sometimes a little bit. It's going to vary in degree. Some people are going to get more, some are going to get less, but it's not going to be, it's going to be like, that's over there, but mostly it's going to be read a whole bunch of Hume, read a whole bunch of Kant. So they're getting exposure to specific people at a disproportionately high rate. So if you had people that were not exposed to that particular tradition, would they converge on the same judgments and positions as the current philosophical consensus? I don't know. Maybe they would, but that's an empirical question. And I don't think that philosophers should presume that they would. And yet I think that many of them do or would if pressed to come down on one side or the other. And I think that reflects a failure to appreciate the nature of human psychology. And I just think that, philosophers, the toolkit they're operating with, physicists are using their minds, but they're also using a bunch of instruments. And when philosophers aren't out there with a bunch of ethicometers that are detecting moral facts. They're not out there with some object that detects the metaphysical nature of reality, or like a fact detector. You don't see epistemologists with factometers, running around detecting facts and justification. This has 17.2 points of justification. We don't have units of justification. And then, when you get the idea. So we don't have that. And, so the way that philosophers think about these things is they lack the instrumentation and tools that the hard sciences have. We're relying on our minds, and our minds, if that's the tool we're operating with, fine. But our minds are, how they work is a question for psychology, cognitive science. How we speak is a question largely for linguistics. Cultural differences between how we speak and how we think and how we differ from one another is a question for anthropology. All of these disciplines are relevant for evaluating what the tool we're using, our minds, how it works, what it's doing, how much different cultural, upbringings influence the way that it functions. To what extent is the architecture of the cognitive systems that we're operating with influenced by enculturation? I suspect a hell of a lot. But again, maybe it's not, but that's an empirical question. And you can't presume from the armchair that it's not influenced or it is influenced a whole lot. That is itself a question to be resolved by engaging with all of these disciplines. And so philosophers are effectively using an instrument while showing a remarkable lack of curiosity for how it works, and with respect to the questions you're asking, whether it works. Why are you using the tool without studying how it works? That's really, really weird. I don't know how philosophy could be done well without a substantial foundation in psychology and cognitive science. I don't understand how it's supposed to work any more than we would run around using thermometers or barometers or whatever other instruments we would be using in other fields without first having a firm foundation in whether they work and how they work and a method of checking with, their reliability. We don't have that in philosophy. We're using tools without knowing how they work. It's really weird. In fact, to a certain extent, we don't even know what the tools are. So if a philosopher generates a judgment, an intuition, an output about a particular philosophical question, which cognitive system did they use? Which system? Let's say there's 80 systems in here. Was it 1 or 33 or 46? Who knows? We don't know. So they're using a system. They're using a sort of almost like a black box where we don't even know what is in there, and they're accepting the outputs of it without having a good understanding of how it works. I mean, arguably, virtually no understanding at all. It's at best rudimentary. That's a very strange state of affairs that we're in. That's very strange. So that matters. And then finally, and this just sort of ties everything together, and this is the concluding section of the blog post, is that mechanisms matter. When it comes to assessing how much we should take what most philosophers think about a particular issue or don't think about it seriously, what matters is the degree to which, and this, this is a sort of amalgamation of all of these, what mechanisms are involved in how they come to their judgments. Are those mechanisms like truth tracking or not? Are they reliable or not? Are they telling us about what the world is like or not? And that is not something that philosophers can claim to have merely in virtue of having studied a topic or having declared themselves experts or being the inheritors of the particular discipline that's asking a particular set of questions. So if astrologers inherited questions about what the stars are, and they continued to discuss them in terms of this dogmatic adherence to like weird paranormal or pseudoscientific sorts of things, well, it doesn't matter if they aspire to answer the questions astronomers wanted to ask. They're using the wrong methods, because you're not going to determine what stars are by reading horoscopes or whatever. The same thing if alchemists were in place of chemists. Well, the methods don't work. The presumptions don't work. They're wrong. And so what matters for the degree to which we should take philosophers seriously is the degree to which the methods work. Okay, well, what are those methods and how do they work? Don't we need to answer those questions first? Don't we need to have some method for checking whether philosophers are getting it right? So take how you would check, and in any other case, in the sciences or in applied disciplines, it's not that we judge that, this person studied engineering, they studied expertise at building things, so they are an expert at building things. Or this doctor studied medicine, so they are an expert at medicine. Rather, we recognize in both of these cases that people that have studied in these disciplines have entered membership into institutions that have a track record of externally corroborated and demonstrable success. They have track records of success. So people that get training as doctors save people's lives and treat people and cure illnesses and relieve symptoms and do all that stuff. And so a person that has training in that system has been trained into a system where people with that training have demonstrable success records. So, that doesn't mean that particular doctor is going to be successful, but doctors on average and overall tend to be more successful, at least than chance, and certainly more than non-doctors with addressing medical issues. And the same for engineering and the same for other sorts of applied disciplines. We have a method of checking. One of my favorite examples is if someone says they're better than you at chess. There's a very easy way to find out if they're better than you at chess. Play them at chess, try to win, and if you keep losing, they're better than you at chess. It's as simple as that. So if you're arguing with someone in philosophy, how do you determine whether they're correct? You can find out if they're better at arguing. Do they keep making you go, I guess you're right? Or keep making you go, I don't have a good response to that. Maybe, but is who's better at arguing necessarily who's more likely to be right? I don't know. Maybe the person in question could be really tricky or be, really good sophistry. Who knows? So in the case of philosophy, what external means do we have of checking whether they're correct? I would want to go with practical questions, but philosophers are going to say, you're begging the question in favor of pragmatism. So, okay, well, then if I can't beg the question, then I don't know. I don't know the answer. Maybe there isn't one. And there certainly isn't one we're going to agree on. So I don't know what to do in that case. I don't know what to do. But I don't think we should grant that philosophers are experts at being correct about philosophical issues. And I think that the considerations I've laid out here provide considerable grounds for considerable skepticism, and that we shouldn't put much stock in what most philosophers think. I just don't think that we should. Okay, that wraps that up. I'm done with the topic for today. I would encourage you to check out the blog and the ongoing series. I have moved it over. I don't know if I mentioned this before. I moved it over to Substack. So let me put a link in there to that. It should also be in the description for the video. So give me one moment and I'll put that in there and then pin it. All right. Let's get that pinned. All right. So whether you subscribed or not, please go over and subscribe to the blog if you're interested in the writing. I do actually more writing than I do talking, which I do a lot of talking, but it's going to be at least 3 posts a week for a while now. Like I said, some of them are real short. Some of them are long. It just has to do with how I divided up the section. Sometimes the section is like 5 paragraphs. Sometimes it's 30. So I just did it that way. I wasn't going to do it by word count or something. So anyway, so that's the blog. Please check that out. I guess the other thing that I'll say is, well, actually, before that, let me check if there's new comments. Okay. I see here another one. Oh, it's somebody responding to somebody else, but we'll have a look since it's already up. Does divine command theory say moral claims are true based on God's stances or based on stance-independent properties? I don't even know the answer to that. So I think that it's going to be an open question. Someone that's more familiar with theistic approaches to metaethics would have a better answer to that. I think the answer is, my guess is that it's going to depend on the form of DCT in question. Here we got this. I thought I was a moral realist until you taught me what that really entailed and found it ridiculous. Well, I appreciate that. So cool. Yeah, so do keep in mind there's at least 2 major forms of moral realism there, and arguably there's other forms. So this is a simplistic breakdown. There's going to be naturalistic forms and non-naturalistic forms. Even the naturalist forms, they're going to be breaking down into whether they're analytic naturalist accounts or synthetic and that sort of thing. And there's going to be subdivisions within subdivisions. So the non-naturalists are going to believe that there are these stance-independent moral facts that are not reducible to, or they can't be addressed to or rendered consistent with the natural sciences in a way where they're sort of accessible in those terms. They're not reducible to natural facts. Whereas naturalists are going to think that they are in various sorts of ways. And so there's, the standard thing I would say about these is that non-naturalism seems to me to be on the right target with respect to what it's trying to offer an account of. It's trying to offer an account of these facts that don't seem capable of readily being, submitting themselves to some naturalistic regimentation and ordering into our picture of the natural world that's understood through the sciences. And they seem to have these interesting sorts of characteristics or properties. They seem to have this sort of clout or authority or oomph. They seem to impel action in a way that seems difficult to capture with the natural sciences, which seem to deal with descriptive questions and not with these sorts of normative questions. And so non-naturalism seems to be, to me, on the right target, but it's the target itself I have a problem with. So I'm either going to think these accounts are false or unintelligible. It's going to depend precisely on how they characterize the position. Whereas the naturalist accounts, I don't know if I'd say I'm a naturalist. It's really going to depend on how you construe it, but probably roughly yes. I tend to not like non-naturalist positions, so I would at least not be a non-naturalist. I could say that. Whether I'd want to call myself a naturalist, I have an aversion to mantles and labels, which is a little weird because my whole thing is all about a label. Anti-realism. In any case, so naturalism, I think, is trying to offer something more acceptable, especially if you take a naturalistic, or very much so if you take a naturalistic approach. The whole point is to render it consistent with the natural sciences. But then I just think it's like sort of a thrown out everything that you would have wanted out of these theories. I think it gives up too much. And what I think it gives up is that authority, that normativity. And it leaves us with these sort of inert facts that look to me like trivial and uninteresting linguistic relabelings of facts that I'm already disposed to grant are true anyway. So if someone says naturalist accounts are correct and there's moral facts or facts about what's increases or decreases cooperation, something's morally good if it increases cooperation, it's morally bad if it decreases cooperation. Okay, well, I already think there's facts about what increases or decreases cooperation. So what is added by saying that that's morally good? Well, you could say, well, I'm giving an account of what people are trying to do when they make moral claims. Okay, so now you've got, at best, a sort of maybe somewhat interesting linguistic account. Okay, but you're not adding to my ontology in any robust way. You're telling me here's how some people use words and how they think, maybe. Okay, fine. I mean, maybe that's true, and it might even be interesting, but ultimately, it's not going to make it the case that I ought to do anything, or at least I don't see how it's going to do that. So if the naturalist accounts want to extract or sort of maintain that normativity, I don't know how they're going to pull that off. So yeah, I guess that's what I would say about those. But yeah, thank you for the kind words. I guess the other thing I should mention is that if you like this content, this should be in greater definition. I definitely am totally open to people supporting me. It's certainly not required, but if you want to, I got Patreon set up. If you go to the blog, you could subscribe on the blog through that. Right now, I don't have any special or exclusive content. If you think that'd be a good idea, let me know, and I'll start working on that. It might take a while to roll that out, but I definitely do want to invest in improving the quality. I think the biggest thing is to have some kind of room set up behind me, so you're not just looking at these stupid doors, and improve that. But I'd like to get a better camera, better mic, and all that stuff. So if you want to support me on Patreon, I think I also have like Stripe in a couple of ways. If you just want to throw me a little bit of money, that would be totally cool. But I'm really kind of self-conscious about asking that. It feels like a weird thing. But if you want to, go for it. If you don't want to, don't. But that is like an option for people that like this content. And I asked a couple people about this, and they were like, "Look, don't view this as like I'm like extracting something from you. It's more that it's like, hey, I want to build a community of people that share my interests and want this stuff out there, like my metaphilosophical critiques, my critiques of moral realism. And so, I don't know. I guess in a certain sense, I'm hoping other people see this as something we're all in together. Look, any support, like just verbal support, like this comment makes me feel great. So, anything you want to do would be great, and just kind words. But also criticism is good too. So if you have stuff to dunk on me, or you think something I said is stupid, please let me know that as well. I like criticism. I like criticism, even if it takes a while for me to appreciate it. I can be upset in the moment. So criticism is good too. So I feel really, it makes me cringe to say that sort of thing. But those are options. And so that should be available in the description for the video as well. But also, yeah, just, I don't know, subscribe, like the video, all that stuff. I really appreciate. All right. So it's been a couple hours. I haven't seen anybody request to like come onto live and talk. Would anyone want to do that right now? If you don't want to now and you want to set something up for another week or something like that, please do. Also, I created Discord for anybody that wasn't here last week. So you could join the Discord. I think that's in the description too. Let's see. It is. So you could join the Discord community, and let's try to build a community. I think it'd be really cool to get more people talking about metaphilosophy, talking about metaethics, talking about moral realism. And of course, you're welcome, regardless of whether you endorse realism or anti-realism. If you want to come in there and argue and debate with people, I'm sure you're going to find a lot of anti-realists. So if you're a moral realist that really wants to argue with anti-realists, that's going to be a good place to go. I'll be there. Other people will be there. I'm going to try to remain as active as I can in there. I know a lot of people get busy and they are not really able to be very involved in their servers, but I'm going to try to be. Okay, you're down to talk. We talked a lot last week. You're down to talk again? You don't think we're going to overdo it? I think it. I mean, is there something new you wanted to talk about? If you want to drop in and say hi, you can do so. I don't know if there's a whole lot to talk about. Let me take a quick break, and while I do that, I will send you the link. So give me a moment. And well, whatever. Let's. I see you also added. We might run into that issue. It might happen. I'll take a quick break, and I'll send you the link. Give me one moment. All right, I am back. The link should be available and it should be pinned. So I haven't seen you try to join yet, but please. Okay, there you are. All right. Hey, how's it going?
Oh, hello. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you fine.
It's not by to say hi. So there is one thing that it's sort of you touched on it earlier today, and that's that when and we talked about this last week. So say you're talking to a philosopher, and he says, you say, "Well, I'm distrustful, or I don't believe you have this sort of special expertise in terms of intuitions or whatnot." And then you say, "Well, you prove it to me somehow." It seems like he could always just accuse you of begging the question. So what do you say at that point? Is that just the end of the discussion? Like, is there nothing more you can say?
Can you maybe restate the issue just so I understand what exactly I'm dealing with here?
Sure. So you mentioned, so say, you're questioning philosophical expertise, right? You're saying, well, you grant that maybe philosophers are good at, say, history of philosophy, or tell you what Hume said, probably better than the average Joe. But that there's a question of, do they have, say, expertise in intuitions or expertise in, getting the right answer in thought experiments, right? And say you get into this debate with a philosopher, and then, you say that you want him to prove or demonstrate somehow in some sort of, with some method that you could both accept, that he's an expert. And you touched on this before, but he could just accuse you of begging the question in favor of pragmatism. And my question is, I guess my question is, at that point, do you just say we can't say anything else and just?
I think maybe. So I don't think that all rational disputes are necessarily resolvable given bounded rationality and the way human agents operate. So yeah, you might just hit a kind of you might hit a point at which the matter is there's no further progress to be made.
Right. Yeah, I figured it. I suppose I don't mean to be polemic when I say this against philosophy, but I suppose you could compare it to arguing against, say, a religious person, where eventually, say, a religious person, an atheist, might hit bedrock, and there might not be anything more to be said.
Yeah, so I think it can be like that. I appreciate you saying you don't mean to be polemic. I want to pause on that to make a point about comparisons. There's this very frustrating thing people will do with comparisons, where if you compare two things, they will read off of the comparison that you're comparing them in respects other than the intended respect, even when you're not. And so someone might take a comparison to be, well, religion is held for dogmatic, unjustified, and ridiculous reasons. And so you're saying philosophers are ridiculous, dogmatic, and unjustified. I think you're not saying that, right?
No, I'm not saying that.
Yeah, because I think even a religious person could make that point. But also, the point of comparison is just that you could find yourself in similar dialectical situations, independent of any other respects in which religious people and philosophers might be similar to one another. And so the point of comparison is just that and not anything else. But yeah, that it's important to ward off those connotative misconceptions about what's being asserted. But you will see people that kind of aggressively push, so you're saying this is just like that? No,
no.
Just in respect. So yeah, I do think it could be like that. And I don't know that there's a way around that. And look, I think philosophers, and this might even include myself, can turn out to be incorrigible about certain philosophical issues, especially more foundational ones. And that's a psychological fact about the person, and I don't think there's anything you can do about it. What can you do?
All right. All right. Yeah, that makes sense. Can't always just keep talking, I guess. So on an unrelated note, you talk a lot about how some of these terms like reason or aren't really substantive or meaningless. perhaps someone could levy a similar critique against things like, so I do hear you use a lot of, say, mental terms like desire, belief, intention. And I suppose one could also levy the critique that those terms are also sort of hard to pin down. So what do you mean when you say you do something? Oh, I wanted to do that. It's really hard to sort of pin down. What do you mean you want to do that? I mean, in some way that's distinct from you just doing it, right? I believe there's this quote from Wittgenstein, when you subtract the fact that what's left when you subtract the fact that my arm goes up from me raising my arm. So do you have any thoughts on how you would perhaps cash out these mental terms?
Yeah. So the first thing I would say is that I don't think that there's going to be any singular correct semantic analysis of the meaning of a term like desire or not. My approach is going to be thoroughly empirical and pragmatic. What I would do with those sorts of terms is, first, I'm not going to presume that there's some sort of essential thing that is a desire. I'm going to be a lot more cautious about the kind of mental states that I permit in my ontology, and that you could imagine air quotes around ontology. Because for me, I'm going to be very much a kind of something like a scientific anti-realist about this. I'm going to approach questions about mental states and then questions about the content of our scientific theories as, I wouldn't say useful fictions, but as useful. And the content, they're cashed out in terms of the way in which we operationalize and deploy the terms. And so a term like desire or belief or attitude or emotion, all of those, I would use those terms in a way where their meaning can vary. And that variation will be in terms of its local operationalization within sort of the local and at present somewhat disconnected and semi-overlapping areas of scientific inquiry, where the application of those terms is operationalized for local purposes and is cashed out in terms of our ability to make predictions and to build useful and predictive models and explanatory models by deploying those terms within those contexts. So the concept of a desire or a belief and other sorts of mental state attributions usefully figure in to various types of psychological theories. And it's that sense in which I would cash out those terms. And what that results in is that those terms can vary in meaning with respect to local application, sometimes in heavily overlapping, but not always necessarily identical ways. And those meanings can be cashed out in terms of, like, I could describe the predictions, or I could describe what the empirical model is doing. I take it that I don't think the non-naturalist moral facts can, or at least can readily figure into explanations of that kind, because the very thing I'm doing is, in a certain sense, naturalizing the terminology and the sort of, you could say, operational concepts. They are operating within an empirical framework. And the whole point of these non-natural facts is that they can't be subjected to that type of operational regimentation. So they just, by their very nature, pretty much by stipulation or definition, you can't do that with them. And so the question is going to come down to this more fundamental metaphilosophical dispute, which is, for me, if you can't do that, then I rule it out of court. Like, that's just a bunch of bullshit to me, basically. But they are going to say, well, on what grounds do you endorse that view? On what's your justification for that? It's certainly not going to be another empirical justification. And this would run me up against the same kind of wall that, positivists would run into with verificationism. So the type of approach that I'm operating with is one for which philosophers are going to come at it with certain presumptions or positions or questions that are difficult for me to answer. And if I try to blow past or dismiss those questions, I think they're in a good position to say I'm begging the question on those matters. So I don't know how to dissolve that in a way that would be satisfactory to them. I might be able to do it in a way that's satisfactory to me. But as I push into the sort of murky recesses of my own metaphilosophical foundations, things become cloudy to me, and I don't have all the answers. I mean, I'm not even close to having all the answers. I'm no decades long established philosopher that's had, many, many years to work out this big system where I've been able to answer this question. I'm not even close to that. So do I have the answers? No. And would I do a good job if like I guess you could say like a mainstream analytic philosopher that was really into metaphysics was pressing me on these questions? No, probably not. I think a lot of them could raise some serious problems for me, and I wouldn't have good answers. In many respects, I'm a novice on a lot of these questions. But this is where my inclinations lie. And so at the very least, my sense is that the pragmatist approach is the better of the approaches with respect to standards and values and positions I care about and would continue to care about on reflection. And the only thing I could do for now is press that point. And I suspect and predict that my future experiences will continue to confirm that. But they might not. And I might end up abandoning the position and judging my former self to have been wrong.
So, right. So I guess what you're saying is, as to the first part, you could sensibly operationalize stuff like belief and desire. So, for example, if someone says, I want to go to the store, and that's going to tell you something about how the person is going to behave. You could predict what the person is going to do in a way that you presumably couldn't with non-natural moral facts. And I suppose you could sort of cash out these sort of mental terms in terms of behaviors and behavioral dispositions and things that is sort of amenable to observation. Is that the gist? Or?
Yeah. Now, the issue with that is that moral realists might claim that there are certain predictions or explanations of observations that are best accounted for by appealing to moral realism. So, for instance, you're going to have arguments for moral convergence. And so one explanation, so you have this observation. Over time, it looks like human societies and individuals within those societies they're on a trajectory of convergence towards a shared set of moral standards. It's not like everyone thinks the same thing, but we're moving in that direction. And one explanation for that is that people are responsive to and updating in light of greater moral reflection and consideration towards the moral facts. So that's the kind of account which one might argue that moral realism is offering an explanation. And in that case, that's why I might rate that as one of the better accounts, because at least I think it's doing the sort of thing that I would care about. I just think it's probably the worst explanation of the available ones. I mean, I'm sure you could come up with worse explanations, like I don't know, leprechauns are influencing our minds in some way or something. Who knows? I mean, you could come up with an infinite number of silly explanations. So of the explanations that are like seriously on offer, I don't think it's as plausible as a bunch of anti-realist explanations, but at least it's trying. So there's that. But for the most part, yeah, I don't even think these kinds of facts it's not even like it's not what philosophers are trying to do with them. I think that philosophers take a lot of these considerations to be accessible via reflection, and they're a priori considerations. This is not a question for the empirical sciences, and they're just not even in the business of trying to do that. And so they wouldn't see they would see my concerns as addressing things from a metaphilosophical perspective, where I'm operating within this framework in which I'm evaluating claims, whether they're meaningful, whether they're true, that they don't even accept that. So why would they care about complying with those standards? And fair enough.
Right. I recall this quip from the philosopher Colin Allen, who is on unrelated content. But he said he thinks there's no non-question begging way to make a point in philosophy. That could be.
To make what kind of philosophy?
So he said that there's no non-question begging way to make an argument in philosophy.
Oh, there might be a sense in which that's true. So, a lot of philosophers really like to push like syllogisms and like these simplified arguments. And what you'll find with those arguments, there's a sense in which all of these sort of formal arguments are question begging. The conclusion is contained somewhere within the premises. And so one could just ask for, okay, well, you could always just ask, what's the justification for premise one or premise two? Let's say we're going with a simple PPC structure. You could say, what's the justification for premise one? And then they would have to give an argument for that, or otherwise you could just reject it. And then whatever that argument is, if it's also PPC, you just question premise one and premise two with that. And this just repeat ad infinitum until they don't want to give you an answer anymore. And yeah, you could do this for anything. And then you're always going to hit a point where the person's like, well, I don't have an answer for you. So yeah, I do think you have a regress problem. I think this is why foundationalism has stuck around for so long and why it continues to maintain a degree of popularity. I don't know what to do about that.
Right. I don't quite recall the philosopher who said this. I think it was Graham Oppie, but he said it was someone who said the best way to change people's minds is through inductive reasoning. Maybe there's some truth to that. Like you try to look for, say, best explanations for things.
Abductive reasoning, you said?
Right.
Yeah, so I'm very strongly in favor of more abductive approaches. I think that's generally the right way to think about things. I think there's an excess of superfluous formalism in analytic philosophy. I think it gives the superficial appearance of rigor and precision, but it's largely a mask for what I take to be a lot of smuggled connotation and sort of tricks of language. So, normative entanglement is one example of this, but a lot of these arguments, I think, hypersimplify things to the point where the arguments are trivial, and they're just ways of sort of initiating a dialogue in a way where one is concealing the bases of one's premises in a way that's just fundamentally unhelpful. So yeah, I see a lot of the formalism as unproductive. That does not mean I'm anti-logic or formalism. I should be clear on that. If you don't know what your argument is, putting it into premise and conclusion format can be extremely useful in figuring out what the heck you mean and what the heck someone else means. There's nothing wrong with that at all. It's a critical skill. But you will see, one thing that's really weird, maybe you've seen this. Do you follow any apologetics stuff?
Right. I am interested in philosophy of religion. So I am interested in apologetics. So there's this channel, Analytic Christian. I like his content. There's James Fodor. I like his content. So I am interested in philosophy of religion and natural theology.
Yeah. So I've seen those channels. So one of the things you'll see, and I don't think either of them would make what I'm about to say is a mistake, because I think they're a lot more careful than that. But you will see some people say, you get this dispute, I guess you could say, between the atheist community and the apologetics community, to whatever extent we even say these are communities, where the apologists will often say, so you get this kind of back and forth, and here's the caricature. So atheists say there's no evidence for God. And then the apologists say, of course there's evidence. Here's a bunch of arguments. Here's the cosmological argument. Here's an ontological argument. Here's the moral argument, yada, yada. We've got evidence. And then the atheists go, arguments aren't evidence. And then the apologists laugh at them and say, of course they are. There's something very strange about that caricature. There's a degree of accuracy to it. You will see these back and forths online. You'll see them all over the place. When people will insist arguments are evidence, that is weird. Is any argument evidence for whatever the conclusion is? It's just that I think that there might be a sense in which that could be said to be true, but there's also a sense in which it's got to be false if one says any arguments for any conclusion or at least some evidence for that conclusion, because then fine, I'll just use ChatGPT and generate an infinite number of valid arguments for some ridiculous conclusion. And now does that build a cumulative case? If bananas are purple, then God exists. Bananas are purple, therefore God exists. If bananas are green, then God exists. Bananas are green, therefore God exists. If bananas are the number 3, then God exists. Bananas are the number 3, therefore God exists. I could just keep doing this. And then does that build a cumulative case? If arguments are evidence, and it means any argument for any conclusion that's valid is some evidence for that conclusion, I can argue for anything. So they can't mean that. So what the hell do they mean? You can make any silly argument for anything. It doesn't make it evidence. There's got to be something more to whether something is evidence. It's got to increase the probability, does it not? And merely in virtue of having a valid argument does not mean you've increased the probability that the thing in question is true.
Right. Well, just from what you're saying, I get the impression that people are just using words in different ways, and I'm not really sure there's anything substantive. It could just be that perhaps the atheist has something in mind, like observational evidence, something empirical, and perhaps the theist is maybe talking about a priori argumentation. Maybe that's it.
Yeah. So someone might say, look, for any of these arguments that we have, like these formal deductive arguments, to the extent that one assigns a non-zero probability, it's like, we got to assume they're valid. And so for any of these non-zero probability valid arguments where you think that the premises might be true, that should adjust your confidence downward relative to whatever position you would have held in the absence of considering the argument. Maybe that would be true. My concern with that is that if you're going to be like, do you get this like Bayesian ratcheting where as long as I give you two marginally not impossible premises for a conclusion, like if potatoes exist, then God exists, potatoes exist, therefore God exists. Well, maybe the existence of potatoes is some like, it's not quite, you might say negligible, but it's non-zero evidence that God exists. And then I could just repeat those kinds of arguments. And if I get enough of them, if like this particular grain of sand on the beach exists, then God exists. It does exist, so God exists. And I just repeat that for all the grains of sand.
Yeah.
Like how many of these can I build where they're not technically zero? And if you're Bayesian, you should update as soon as I give you the argument, where I create a machine that just spits out these arguments just nonstop all day long, thousands a second. Like, does someone have to consider the machine? And then after it runs for an hour, they got to go, shit, I guess God exists.
Yeah.
It's ridiculous. So something is off here.
Right. I mean, to stick up for the machines, those AIs are pretty clever, like ChatGPT and Bard. Those are pretty smart. So stick up for them. But yeah, I guess I see the point you're making. I suppose one response is that the atheist could do the same thing and say, well, this grain of sand on the beach is evidence that God doesn't exist. And you might say that that's some marginal evidence that God doesn't exist, and you do it for every grain of sand on every beach. And so I suppose at the end we're at the same place we started at. Yeah,
maybe we could just like round down for all the negligible stuff and then just deal with the arguments as we already do. And then nothing has really changed. Do you mind if I address some of the questions in the chat?
Oh, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I don't want to let them linger for too long. I used to, I say used to, like this is years ago. This was like 3 weeks ago. I would answer questions like an hour and a half later because I would just be like, blah, 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 philosophers. Okay, so let's have a look. And you're welcome to weigh in on these too, I guess, since you're here. So feel free. So we got this question. How would you respond to a realist who says that you do the very thing you criticize in the case of gastronomic realism, intuit that most people are not gastronomic realists without empirical research? That's a good question. So there's a couple things. The first thing is I would just cede the point. Maybe people are gastronomic realists. That's an open empirical question. The second thing I would say about that is that a lot of the initial studies in the empirical literature and the psychology of metaethics used several, you could say, comparison or control conditions. They weren't strictly speaking like experiments. I guess some were, but it wasn't really the purpose. These weren't really serving as control so much as like points of comparison. And so a lot of those, for instance, Goodwin and Darley 2008 and Wright, Grandjean, and McWhite 2013. I mention all these things and then I never put them in the description for people to get the sources. In any case, they would compare judgments, metaethical judgments, to judgments about factual disputes in like science or geography or math or whatever. And then taste disputes, and this would include music and movies and also food, like taste judgments. And then a fourth one would be social conventions. So what they found in those cases is that for many of the taste judgments, you're going to get very high levels of the anti-realist response rates. Of course, we could question the validity of these measures. In fact, I would do so. But that research is out there, and it seems to show that basically people give very strongly anti-realist responses to those. I'm open to those studies not being valid, and I would just see the point. People could be realist about gastronomic considerations. That strikes me as really implausible, but I'm basing that off of armchair psychological speculation. I could be wrong about. I would bet against it, but could be right. So that's what I would say. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Oh, sure. I suppose a lot of the same criticisms you've levied against attributing, say, moral realist views to people could be levied against any attempt to attribute gastronomic realist views to people. And so I mentioned this before, but a lot of these philosophical categories just don't really reflect the way ordinary people talk and think. And, some of the time you'll get people getting into like really fierce debates about what seem like matters of taste, like movies or food or who's good looking or whatever. But it doesn't seem like you could infer from that any sort of philosophical position. I mean, for people also, they don't get angry at you if you order some different dish than they do at the restaurant. And maybe some people do, but
some people would, and not, we're setting aside for like moral reasons or financial reasons. Like if someone takes you out to dinner and then you order the most expensive thing in the menu, they might say that's too expensive. Or, if, you order something that, you order octopus or dolphin or something, a lot of people have ethical objections to that. They might say, hey, you can't eat that. Or you shouldn't eat that. So that's a moral objection. But there could just be someone that's like, oh, you're going to eat that? That's like, okay, here's one where people, like, imagine I go out to a restaurant with some friends. And then you order a steak well done, and then you put ketchup on it, something like that. People are going to get upset about that. Or I go out and I order a pineapple on a pizza. Someone's going to comment on that. So there's lots of things that people can order that people are going to people get weird about, like all kinds of food stuff. Same thing with music and movies. People are going to get upset. Oh, that's not real music. So people do dispute those sorts of things. A couple things I've given this comparison before. Actually, before I say all that, I should say, if you're agreeing with me about that, do keep in mind, it's like virtually no philosopher or psychologist, including those who study this topic, that I've ever met agrees with me about any of this. My views are seen as, like, I think, really radical and out there. In a certain sense, I kind of like that. And in another sense, I do want more people to agree with me. So maybe with time, it'll change, and then more people will agree with me, and then I won't get to say my view is too weird. But the view that most people don't have views about these, almost nobody thinks this, as far as I'm aware, that's like works on these questions. Anyway, important thing about disagreement. A lot of times people will see disagreement as a disagreement about what the facts are, like especially like objective or stance independent facts. But a couple things, people can disagree within an intersubjective framework. So sometimes people will mistakenly think that relativists can't disagree with one another, and that's not true. If you have two cultural relativists that are in the same culture, they can argue about what the moral facts are relative to their culture. So that's possible. And then people can also argue with respect to intersubjective standards. So if a group of judges are judging a musical performance, they might say, okay, these are the standards we're going to use. Technical skill, like number of errors, like elegance or something. Like they might have a range, like, and we're going to weight them in these ways. Or like food shows. I watch a lot of food shows. So they might focus on taste, technical skill, creativity, and like plating, like presentation. And then they're going to weight all those. They might do 30, 30, 30, 10 or something like that. And then they will disagree or agree. And if you say, do you think there's an objective fact about how good a plate is? They might say, no. Ultimately, it's subjective, but within a shared intersubjective framework. So there's that type of disagreement. And then third, some disagreements are not about what's true, but they're about what to do. So people could disagree. The standard example I give is a group of friends want to order a pizza. They disagree about pizza toppings. Well, should we get mushrooms? Should we get peppers? Should we get tomatoes? That sort of thing. And there's not a fact of the matter about what they should do. They're really negotiating an outcome. And the same thing happens if you and another person are like arguing about the price. Like you want to buy a car and you're like, I'll give you 10,000, and they're like 12, and you're like, how about 11? There's not a fact of the matter about the price of the car, but you're still disagreeing about the price of the car. So it's really weird to not acknowledge that disagreement in a lot of domains may not be indicative of a dispute about facts, but a dispute about coordination. I don't know if you have any final thoughts about that, and then we'll move on to the next question.
Right. I guess disagreement or disagree is sort of an overloaded word. Like you could use it in many different senses.
Right. And I just wish people were clear. That's all. Moving on.
Oh yeah, let's see the next
next
question.
Cool. Yeah, I just sort of recruited you for a Q&A. I hope you're cool with that. If you're not, that's totally okay.
That's great. This is great.
Okay, awesome.
Great, yeah.
No, but for real, I don't want to make you feel like you have to answer people's questions. So if you don't have anything to say, that's cool. I didn't want to leave people out. I want everybody to feel like they're part of this.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, we dropped down to, I think, 7 people. We had 20 before. Everyone's leaving. That's too bad. Okay, so we got this. I would say that the mere existence of an argument isn't evidence for the conclusion, but someone actually accepting the conclusion based on the argument could be considered Bayesian evidence. You want to take that one?
I would say that the mere existence could be considered Bayesian evidence. Okay, well, let's see. There's an additional. Let me read this to just get some help interpreting.
Yeah, there's more here.
Because it probably is more likely for someone to believe something if it's. Oh, okay. So what I think he's saying, Shiny Baboon, please correct me if I'm. So it's like if somebody accepts a conclusion, like say you accept an argument, like some religious person say accepts some argument for God's existence, the fact that he's accepting that is some evidence in favor of God's existence, because people generally people are more likely to believe something if it's true than if it's false, which is basically the conciliationist view about disagreement. So what I would say there is it would depend on the reference class, right? So, there are some areas where people are generally quite reliable. Like I've said this before, but vision, where people may be very good at seeing things in clear conditions when they're not tired, right? But they're not very good at seeing things when, it's dark outside or they haven't slept. And whether or not people are more likely to believe true things than false things. Maybe overall that's true. So if you didn't know anything else, right? Somebody accepts this argument. Maybe that would be some evidence in favor of the conclusion. But I think it would be helpful to sort of examine the reference class. And Lance, you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that seems basically right. I would say all else being equal, if I'm being a Bayesian about something, the fact that someone believes something to be true, I take to be some minimal evidence that it's true. It's going to vary with a lot of factors and considerations. But I would take people accepting an argument at the very least to be some possibly very, very, very tiny evidence that is true. But yeah, so I would agree with that. So I would take accepting arguments, or a simpler way to put it is people believing certain sorts of things, I would take as evidence of those things.
Right. That makes sense.
But it's not gonna be very good evidence. So like most people believe in God, I don't take that to be great evidence that God exists. I don't take it to be totally negligible and ridiculous though. But a lot of people believe in a whole bunch of things. I think it's just, you have to weigh that against a bunch of other considerations. Okay. And then this last question for now, what are your thoughts on foundationalism versus coherentism? That's like, what are your thoughts on epistemology? That's too big of a question for now. At the end of this, I know I pose these things at the end, but that's the kind of thing where one, I'd really want to sit down and formulate my thoughts about it. And two, that's a big question. So I guess I'll address that another time. Okay, that I think should get us up to date, although there is a follow-up here. Yeah, that's all I'm saying. Not necessarily saying it's particularly strong evidence. Yeah. Okay. So we're on the same page there, at least you and I. Okay. Right. So did you have other thoughts or anything else you wanted to talk about?
Right. I suppose just a quick thought on foundationalism versus coherentism. I'm not as familiar with coherentism as I am with foundationalism, and I'd like to read more about it. But I know, like in passing, stuff like Quine's web, and that seems just appealing to me, but I'd have to read more about it. That's it for that question. Yeah.
Fair enough. Did you have any other topics or anything you wanted to bring up?
Sure. There is one thing. Yeah. So this is something I was thinking about. So say someone were to question the methods of, say, history, right? Which is sort of a backwards looking discipline, right? They just try to figure out what happened in the past. Like say someone were just a skeptic of historians and their methodology, and they said, "Oh, these guys are just not, they're not on the right track." What do you think the sort of method of resolving the dispute would be in that case? Because it's not like they can you know, I'm somewhat ignorant of history, right? But presumably they can't just do an experiment to tell you such and such happened or whatnot.
That's an awesome question. I don't know. I mean, one, I don't know enough history, and I certainly don't like. If I were to go study history, it would be as a non-specialist. It would be like and also what I would learn is the facts as the historians say they are. I'm not learning their methods. So if I studied history, it would be studying the output of historical work. It wouldn't be studying the practice of doing historical research. So the former, even if I were knowledgeable of like what Napoleon supposedly did or whatever, I don't know how people determined what Napoleon did. I don't know what records they checked. I don't know how they figured that out. I don't know if there's reasons to be skeptical. So I don't know a damn thing about doing historical analysis. So I have no idea what the methods of those disciplines look like. But in those cases, you don't have. I mean, in some cases, you're going to have quite a bit of I guess you could say archaeological and historical evidence. So if someone wants to say Napoleon existed, I mean, we have like portraits of Napoleon. So you're going to have this. You're going to have a certain degree of constructing coherent narratives, and different accounts are going to appear more or less coherent given the content of those accounts compared to other ones. That's going to be a factor there. But there might, in some cases, not be a whole lot of means of independent or external corroboration. So we might have a record that somebody exists, like, especially like ancient historical figures. We don't know. We don't have a body. We don't have any direct indication and any forensic evidence of their existence. What we have are reports about them, and how reliable are those? And how do we assess how reliable those are? Those are tough questions. I don't know how to answer those. I think that might mean there might be reasons to be more skeptical of the historical narratives we're given. There might be a lot of falsehoods and inaccuracies in them. And I presume that historians have ways of, at the very least, roughly, and in some cases more precisely, assessing the degree of reliability of the records in question. So certain historical, like historians themselves, because historians might work with previous historians' work, some of them are going to be more or less reliable. I think a lot of that is going to be about mutual corroboration. And so multiple distinct people converging on similar answers is going to be, good evidence that a particular thing is true. But again, I don't know enough about historical method. I might just exhaust my limits in some cases and end up being very skeptical of a lot of things. But I don't think, there's that, one philosopher's modus ponens is another's modus tollens. What I wouldn't necessarily do is say, well, I trust historians and they don't have independent means of corroboration, so I should also trust philosophers despite not having independent means of corroboration. I would be perfectly comfortable going in the opposite direction up to a point and saying, okay, well, I'm a little bit more skeptical of history now. Although I'm probably less skeptical of history than I am of philosophy, because history is at least, engaged with stuff. We have records, we have written works, we have archaeological findings, we have pictures. So it's dealing with some externally things capable of external corroboration. We could all go look at a picture of the Mona Lisa, and that's going to be some evidence of that the Mona Lisa exists. So there's going to be some there's also going to be, we're going to be able to do like paint analysis and analysis of other sorts of things. So let's say we have a new paint, like for instance, if I show people a new painting that I found in an old basement that hasn't been opened since the 1600s, and the painting is done in a style that looks like other paintings from the 1600s that we have dated using credible dating methods, that is going to increase the plausibility that the painting really is from the 1600s. Now, if it looks like it's 200 years ahead of its time, now we're going to suspect a forgery, and that's going to be based on, so there's going to be some degree of empirical corroboration for at least some historical claims. And I feel like a lot of the narratives that we end up constructing are going to ratchet into them. So, if certain historical narratives were drawing on places that don't appear to exist, or reported facts that are inconsistent with the sciences, or imagine we say there was this ruler that ruled in this region from 122 to 113, and then we actually have independent and really good evidence that is right in the middle of two other reigns of different rulers in the same area. maybe that's good evidence that person didn't exist, and we have no other evidence. So you see, I guess, does that give some sense of how I would go about addressing this?
Right. So I guess a lot of it would depend on just constructing an overall narrative and making sure the pieces fit. So, for example, if you were a Napoleon denialist, it would be, I don't know, maybe there are those people, but if you were a Napoleon denialist, you'd have a very difficult time explaining all the paintings and the letters and I suppose the, written records of his campaigns or whatever. I suppose if you were a Da Vinci denialist, you would have to explain the Mona Lisa, and I don't know what else he did.
Yeah.
I suppose that makes sense. So it would be about an overall fit with everything else that we know and stuff that.
Yeah, and it also is it sort of ratchets into a broadly naturalistic and empirically verifiable framework of understanding the world in a way that I don't think that philosophy does quite as well. So there may be cases where there's little or no external corroboration for particular historical claims. My guess is historians would adjust their confidence in the plausibility of those claims downward accordingly. So in other words, I think that to the extent that historical claims can have a degree of empirical support, they're supported to that extent. To the degree that they don't, they aren't. And that's not so bad. That's not a terrible situation to be in. And I don't think philosophy quite has that degree of integration with empirical sciences.
Right. So I think some of it is. So I know work by, I think you mentioned them Moschery and Stitch, for example. I've read some stuff by them, and they do seem to engage a lot with the sciences.
Right, but that's exactly the work I'm going to credit with being the kind of philosophy I'm cheering for. So, when people if Dennett offers this account of consciousness, even if you think Dennett is wrong, to the extent that the account attempts to engage with and construct itself in accordance with the best available cognitive science, that's a good thing. And I hope more philosophers take that approach. But, a lot of this a prioristic stuff just seems to float free of relevant empirical considerations. That isn't to say it necessarily does, just that I'm saying in practice it does. And especially in cases when philosophers are dealing with these sort of straightforward metaphysical intuitions, they're just intuiting that there's properties or facts of particular kinds, and by their very nature these aren't the sorts of things that could be fit within our naturalistic frameworks. That's when I'm going to be the most suspicious. That isn't to say all philosophers do that.
Right. I remember a while back I emailed you about the question regarding Chalmers' zombies argument. And I just raised the objection, well, couldn't you just say this about anything? Say you build the sort of car, in accordance with all the principles of physics and engineering, and you can imagine the car not turning on. I don't know, there's something about these. Can you really imagine that? What's the criteria exactly for success here? Are you really imagining the thing?
Yeah, so that actually is a question in the PhilPapers survey. Let's have a look at it. Have you seen that one in the PhilPapers survey?
Zombies conceivable or
yes,
metaphysical?
So we have zombies inconceivable, conceivable, but not metaphysically possible, or metaphysically possible. And we have inconceivable has 16.4%. So that's not without representation among analytic philosophers, many of whom I think would not be very well disposed towards illusionism and some of the more, you could say, sparse, reductive, and even going further, a eliminativist views about consciousness. Most people aren't big fans of those. And yet you do have quite a bit of people saying, yeah, zombies are inconceivable. Yeah, these questions about conceivability I find very strange. Something can seem, I suspect something conceivable to you just because you don't understand it. So if you don't know much about prime numbers, then I can imagine how 14 could seem like a prime number to you. Okay, well, then you don't understand prime numbers. If you do understand prime numbers, then it's not going to be conceivable. And this is part of where I'm coming from when I argue against the intelligibility of certain concepts, is that I think in virtue of having a clear understanding of the domain in question, one can recognize that certain proposals are not they don't make sense of the content of the domain. And then in virtue of understanding, one renders oneself incapable of having the sense that something seems conceivable. So it's precisely people that understand what a prime number really is that can't conceive of 14 as a prime number. Because that's just not what it is. It's precisely those people that are confused or misunderstand that could report it seeming conceivable. And so when I challenge the certain philosophical claims as being intelligible or meaningful or substantive or whatever, I'm not simply, one possibility is I don't understand, but another possibility is the proponent of the idea doesn't understand. And I don't think we should just presume that if any particular person doesn't understand, that person is the confused one. It could be the person using the term. Now, and this is really relevant to the topic for today, because what a lot of those people say is, yeah, but most of us know what the term means. I mean, they usually say know what the term means and not claim to know what the term means. Of course, if they're really asserting as like a data point that they know what the term means, that's question begging. But if they dial that back and say, look, most of us are claiming to know what the term means, and that's a good reason to think it's meaningful. How good of a reason? What I've argued today is not much of one.
Right. So it's like say someone, like the more you understand of, say, I don't know, human physiology, the more it's just going to be, the more stuff like qualia is just going to seem like nonsensical.
Yeah, and I can't say that I have like a great understanding of human psychology and that sort of thing. I am actually largely operating on abductive and inductive inference here, which is resulted in my being extremely suspicious of any time philosophers use terms and concepts that seem almost like they're motivated by a desire to retain mysteries in the world. Like the very idea of qualia is like, don't take away my special magic phenomena. And that's not a very nice way of framing the issue. I think philosophers are sincerely and genuinely convinced that there's something substantive here, and that scientists have legitimately gone overboard when they want to eliminate or reduce or dismiss or ignore mysteries. And I think there's merit in that concern too. So when they're like, look, a lot of scientists, when there's no free will because we did a study and we could predict what you're going to pick in these contrived circumstances. So there's no free will. Well, you're being way too quick there, scientists. And so I think philosophers are right to be cautious about the degree to which people want to jump to philosophical conclusions from empirical findings far too quickly. And this is one of my main criticisms of experimental philosophy and these attempts to integrate the empirical sciences, is that people could be a little too eager, and then they end up making blunders by overstepping what the evidence can really tell us.
Right. I think that's a fair criticism. I suppose, I guess it would depend on how the scientist is like operationalizing what they're trying to eliminate. I'm going to be honest, I think so I don't really understand a lot of the libertarian accounts of free will. They strike me as really mysterious and like kind of nonsensical. So there might be that problem. So when the scientist is saying we don't have this, that they're not like saying anything because it's like incoherent and nonsensical. But I can sort of understand that concern that I guess saying something like that could have a lot of like baggage attached to it. I believe there's this Dennett quote: "There's no such thing as philosophy-free science, only science that's taken on philosophical baggage unexamined," or something to that effect.
Yeah.
Shiny Baboon has another question.
I didn't know.
It's part of his. It's actually earlier on. It's also, have you considered the possibility that, for example, 80% of philosophers could endorse a view? Right.
That's a good point. So if you look at the PhilPapers survey, what you'll see is that there's actually a distinction between accept and lean towards. And so presumably anybody that was only at 51% confidence would have chosen lean towards. And you could draw that distinction in the survey. So let's see what we get for moral realism. What you get there is 37.4% accept and 24.7% lean towards. So lean towards, that's presumably going to be anyone that's between like 51% and some unspecified larger percentage. Who knows the point at which any particular person would say that they accept rather than lean towards? Maybe 80%, maybe 82%, maybe 91%. I don't know. But yeah, you're still going to get the most common response to that question is accept moral realism. But you're right that confidence levels here matter. So what if it turned out that the 26% of anti-realists all said 99% confident, and then the average confidence among realists was like 64%? Maybe that should matter to our assessment of the consensus. And that data hasn't been thoroughly quantified in any rigorous way in the study. And to be fair, that would be an absurdly excessive thing to try to quantify when you're asking so many questions and you're asking such a diverse range of questions. If you're trying to get people's exact confidence percentage for all these questions, that might be asking too much. And then you're just going to get like higher attrition, a lower response rate, and that kind of problem. You would just introduce other problems. Whenever you make surveys more cognitively demanding, longer, more difficult, and more annoying, you're going to get less people answering them. And then that differential attrition is going to lead to potential selection effects where the kinds of people disposed to answer long, irritating, annoying, cognitively demanding surveys systematically differ from people that aren't willing to do so. For instance, you could get all the philosophers that at the time they're answering the questions happen to be less busy. And now you actually have a survey of the least busy philosophers. What does that tell you about philosophers in general? Who knows? That's a weird consideration, but I don't think it's totally implausible. I bet the survey was answered by people that are less busy on average compared to the people that didn't answer it. Wouldn't it be weird if that wasn't true? So what we actually have is a survey of the least busy philosophers.
Is that like a big problem in like psychology when you get people a survey and then they just get a few questions in, they get like bored or something, and they just say, does that happen in person? Like, say you're giving someone a survey in person, and then partway through they just say, like, I'm bored. Maybe they wouldn't phrase it that way, but
it doesn't happen that often. I don't have a lot of experience conducting studies in person, so I couldn't speak much to that. I've mostly done like Amazon Turk studies, like when I've conducted my research. So, I've mostly done online studies. People getting bored and quitting studies does happen. And it's going to vary based on a lot of factors. So the length of the study, the demandingness of the study, like how much you're asking them to do, the kind of task you're asking them could influence whether they're going to quit the study. The context in which you're asking them, the anticipated compensation or benefits from participating in the study. I could go on. Probably the time of day matters. So there's going to be so many factors that influence. Some of them are going to be marginal. Some of them are going to be big. So the length of the study is probably going to be the biggest factor in attrition. There might be some lower threshold where it doesn't matter too much, like under 3 or 4 minutes. But if you're giving people a 1-hour study, I think a lot of them are going to quit. If they're in person, I think I don't know how that stacks up to if they're doing it in an online survey. So, there's going to be too many factors for here. And I haven't looked at the data on that to know what the general patterns are. But do people quit studies because their studies are boring or annoying? Yeah, they do.
That actually reminds me of something else I wanted to talk to you about. Forgive me if this is off topic, but I was thinking about that replication, about replication. And I remember last week we talked about how a lot of psychological studies don't replicate. And what I was thinking is, that might not be the only problem with something, right? So, like say you get something that's replicating, right? And it's not, people aren't, hiding the failed studies, and they're not, p-hacking, or they're not doing any of that stuff, right? Like the whole thing could just still be a house of cards, right? Because they're not actually measuring anything. Like it's not something that really predicts, because the methodology is flawed. Like that could also be the case, right?
What exactly are you asking?
Sorry. So let's say you have a study, and it doesn't have to be in psychology, but whatever field, right? And it replicates, you get the result from the study, it replicates, and people aren't, committing fraud, or they're not doing any of that stuff, right?
Yep.
But it could be still that basically because of the methodology or whatever, right? That perhaps they're not measuring what they think they're measuring, or, you know, it's there's no like, you can't really predict anything, say, out in the real world. Like, it's just a construct in the lab or something. Or, do you know what I'm getting at?
Oh, absolutely. So this is the sort of, I guess you could say, the sort of centerpiece of my own methodological concerns with work in experimental philosophy. So in my dissertation, there's quite a few chapters. So there's a sort of introductory chapter, and then the last 3 chapters are all empirical chapters. But in between, I have 2 chapters that are methodological critiques of existing work in the psychology of metaethics. The first of those chapters, chapter 2, deals with the disagreement paradigm, because that's the dominant paradigm in psychology of metaethics. And then chapter 3 deals with, in much more briefer terms, all the other paradigms that I was able to gather. There's been a couple new studies since then that I don't address, because they came out after the paper was written. But what I argue in there, and I make this point, is that it doesn't matter how well a study replicates if it's failing to measure what it's intended to measure. And my concern in those chapters is, and what I argue is, like, I guess you could say it's bold, is I argue all existing measures of the psychology of metaethics are all invalid, all of them.
Wow.
And so that's a strong claim. But I also argue that in the case of measuring beliefs about free will, not in there, but elsewhere, it's not published yet. And in a few other places, I think that the measures, all or most of the measures, are invalid. And the reasons why I think that are complicated, but they come down fundamentally to, I don't believe that the participants in these studies, or at least I think that the majority of participants in the studies, are not interpreting the questions in the way that the researchers intend for them to be interpreted. And that's a necessary condition for the measure to be valid. If the intent is to capture the psychological construct of interest, there's a caveat there, which is that someone could interpret the question in an unintended way that happens to correlate very closely with the intended interpretation. And in that case, you're still it's like a proxy for the measure. And so it would sort of incidentally be predictive of the things you want to predict. And in that case, you have like a fortunate coincidence. So that can happen. It's kind of like maybe there's a term for this. It's almost like a Gettier study.
Oh,
like it's good. Like a Gettier case.
That's really good.
where by chance it happens to be a valid measure. So that could happen in principle, where they don't interpret it as intended. They interpret it in some other way, but the way that they interpret it happens to be such that you're actually getting precisely what you would get were they to interpret it as intended. So in principle, that can happen. In that case, functionally, you would have like a valid measure, even though the psychological representations involved in their judgments are not what you want them to be, like based on your model, which would be a really weird case, that they're sort of survey outputs are consistent with your model, but the psychological states are not. So that could happen. How often does that happen? I have absolutely no idea, because I just thought of that now. So no idea. So that could happen. So setting that aside, if we ignore that possibility for a moment, I don't think we should ignore it, but I'm going to ignore it for the sake of simplicity. If the unintended interpretations reliably result in answers that are not reflective of what you're trying to measure, you've got a serious problem. And one of the more insidious features about this, and I call it insidious for a reason, is that the studies can replicate. So the simplified example I would give is the standard example you've probably heard me give this, is the bank question. So do you like going to the bank? 1 to 7, 1 I hate going, 7 I love going. You ask a bunch of people that question, and you ask all over the place, and you get, say, 10% of the population interprets it as a question about riverbanks, 90% about financial institutions. And so you get this interesting distribution where you get one big bump where the vast majority of people don't like going to the bank. And so you get this sort of bimodal distribution where on that 7-point scale, you get this really big bump around a 2 of not liking going. And then you get this tiny little bump around a 6 of people really like going. And so you see this bimodal distribution. So you get a big bump and a little bump. And you go, wow, okay, so what we have is that with respect to the goal of measuring, do people like going to financial institutions, there's a big chunk of people that don't like going. And then there's this small number of people, like 10% of people, love going to financial institutions. Well, you're wrong. They don't. So it could be that virtually all of the people in that 10% that are that bump around the 6 actually just like going to riverbanks. And so you get this illusory pattern. And it's The problem is it's replicable. And it's very difficult, but through using standard quantitative methods to determine whether or not that distribution that you have is reflective of a valid measure or not. Standard quantitative measures are just not adequate to get the job done. Because when you're constructing the scale that you're using, the survey, the method, whatever it is you're using, the standard validation procedures are going to involve things like appealing to convex alpha. So you're going to look at how well people's responses to some subset of measures that are intended to measure the same thing correlate with one another. You could look at factor analysis. You could look at predictive validity. You could look at a host of different types of measures. The problem is that those validation procedures appear to be consistent. They set a very low bar, and they're largely based on coherentist assumptions rather than any sort of direct way of determining what the psychological states of the participants are. We're doing a lot of this stuff. We're dealing with like this sort of causal black box. We don't know exactly what's really driving the responses to these questions. So that's a problem. Now, my approach to this is so straightforward, blunt, and obvious that it might seem silly. So what I did, and this is something my advisor used to say. So people in my department or guests or whatever would give a talk, present their quantitative social psych findings, and then my advisor would have that hand raised and go, did you ask them why they answered the question that way? And the answer was, as far as I know, always, maybe there was one or two exceptions, no, they never asked. So when I looked at this metaethics literature and I saw this weird pattern of responses, people are relativists about some things and realists about others. People are cognitivists about some things and non-cognitivists about others. That's weird. So I thought, why don't we just ask people why they're answering that way? Or what do they think the question is asking them? Or you could give them someone else's answer to the question. So you take Alex and Sam disagree about murder. Alex thinks murder's okay. Sam thinks murder's not okay. Do you think they're both correct? Or do you think they're not, that at least one's wrong? And a previous respondent said that they're both correct. What do you think that respondent means when they give that answer? So ask people stuff like that. So you ask them about people's answers. You ask them about the questions. You ask them why they answered the question. You ask them what the question is asking. I did all of those. And then what I did is I took the written responses from people. No multiple choice, although I did do those too. But I took written responses from people. And I said, please just explain why you answer this way or what you think this person means when they give this answer. And then I had to go through and look at those. And it's really tough to do this. But I looked at them and I coded them for, did the person clearly interpret this in the way that the researcher intended or not? And the answer for the metaethics paradigms, for virtually everyone I checked for most of the questions, you had very, very low rates of clearly intended interpretations. In a lot of cases, it's hard to tell, but you do get very high rates of clearly unintended interpretations. So for example, one study asked people if they think there's an objective answer to certain sorts of moral questions. So like a very blunt, I think I called it an explicit paradigm, where you just basically ask people, do you think morality is objective? Or do you think this moral issue has an objective answer? One of the things I did is ask people what they think it means for morality to be objective. And people will say things like, it means that one's judgments about it are made in an unbiased way. That's not a common answer, but a couple of people said stuff like that. Now, is that a ridiculous interpretation of objective?
No, because you could do like, oh, I reviewed the movie objectively, and you could just mean
yeah.
that, you know, you don't have some sort of, you don't dislike the director, for example, or.
So like one ordinary usage of the term objective is to make judgments in an unbiased way. So that's a totally understandable interpretation. So a few people would interpret it that way. A lot of people might interpret it to mean measurable, like there's some standard of measure that we've agreed on, but that is consistent with an intersubjective standard. It doesn't have to be an objective standard.
Right.
So that is not necessarily a clearly intended interpretation. Some people might mean that you think that the matter is black and white or it's not gray. So that might indicate some sort of categorical or decisive way of addressing the question. But that arguably is an epistemic concern, not a metaphysical one. And so it's not indicative of a view about stance independence. So as you can see, and there's like a whole bunch of these possibilities, and they emerge in various proportions when you code people's responses. So what you don't get is a bunch of people that just don't answer the question or say things that make no sense. You get completely sensible responses that are perfectly comprehensible and understandable and creditable interpretations of these questions that simply aren't what the researchers intended. So it's not like the people are revealing that they're linguistically incompetent. They are linguistically competent, and they're doing their best to interpret questions that lack the philosophical superstructure in which these questions are posed when philosophers ask one another about the questions. So they're missing the context where if I ask a philosopher, do you think morality is objective? They're going to tend to interpret it in the intended way as stance independent. But a non-philosopher doesn't know what the hell you're asking them because they're not steeped in those traditions and they're not operating within that context. So why would they know what you're asking them? So this is the problem. And there's a deeper problem here, which is that philosophers at conducting these studies are insensitive to pragmatics. They're insensitive to context. And I think that this generalizes to psychological research more broadly, is that researchers reliably presume that the participants will interpret questions that are asked often outside of a lab in decontextualized instances. And so they're asked a question outside of the context in which the questions would ordinarily be proposed and the judgments would ordinarily occur about hypothetical cases that are lacking context and are occurring outside the contexts in which they ordinarily. So I'm supposed to make a judgment about a disagreement. Who the hell are these people? Why do they disagree with each other? How do they know? Do they know one another? Like those factors are arguably relevant to the way that people would assess typical actual moral disagreements. And yet you're stripping these situations of all the rich context. And a philosopher might say, yeah, I'm doing exactly what an experimentalist in science should do, is I'm removing all of the extraneous, like that, I'm sorting the wheat from the chaff and getting at their pure semantic intuitions. Well, hold up. What if actual moral judgments, it's a constitutive part of the moral judgment that it factors in the pragmatic considerations? Well, now you're throwing out things that are constitutive of the judgment. So now you've thrown out the good stuff.
Right. It could be. So what if it's what if you said, what if it's just pragmatics all the way down?
Yeah, so that's what I say. I say it's pragmatics all the way down. Unfortunately, I am going to have to go. I'm going to have to wrap it up there. So, but I don't want to just jump. So I'm going to do some final remarks. So let me give you some final remarks because I know I just talked for a whole lot there. Any last things you want to say? And if not, that's cool.
No, that's really interesting. I was just going to ask super quickly. Do you know if this generalized to other philosophical questions? Like,
I haven't looked into it too deeply. So I haven't conducted these studies for any other questions. So I simply don't have empirical evidence in any other domain. So the bottom line is I don't know. I have looked at measures for belief in free will, and I suspect it will apply to those, but I haven't run the studies yet.
Right. Yeah, that was really interesting. Okay, I think we also got we got shiny baboons questions. That's all I have to say. It's great chat.
Awesome. Thanks so much for being here. So I'll let you off the stage if you don't mind. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, I felt like I feel weird like booting someone out of here, but it's good for me to go back to like one big screen.
Right.
And, make all the final announcements. All right. So take care and thanks so much for coming on here again. Right. Let's keep doing this, and we'll cross the bridge if we keep repeating material too much when that happens, if it happens, and if it doesn't, great. All right. Take care. Thanks so much.
Have a good one.
Yep. All right, so that is going to wrap it up for today. I thought this was going to be a short one, and it turned into a super long one. So thanks so much for those of you who have stuck it all out for this long. So we'll wrap it up there. Again, I have moved my blog over to Substack, so please go check that out. I'm happy with my blog. I think it's cool. Subscribe to my channel if you haven't done that already, and you're up for doing that. Like this video. Leave comments. I love comments. I try to go through and respond to as many of them as I can. Get conversations going, do all that stuff. So like, subscribe, all the stuff. What else? There's going to be a bunch of new content on this channel and on my blog. And there's going to be more. I've got some things scheduled. So I'm going to start having content very soon, probably in maybe as little as a week, maybe 2 weeks of new content that is not live streams. It's going to be recorded content. So that's going to be super cool. I guess a shout out to other channels. So K&B has a bunch of material on meta ethics if you like that content. So yeah, go check that out. I can't think of any off the top of my head right now. There's been some new videos, but I can't remember the channel names. So I'm not going to look them up. So I'm closing things out. But I'll mention them later when I get a chance. So you could go check those out too. So if you like meta ethics content, then you could check that out. And yeah, I could see I'm twisting up my words because I'm getting too tired here. So I'm going to close it out. So see you all later, and I will play the outro clip. So take care, and thanks everybody for being here. See y'all later.